If you've found yourself here tonight, welcome. Maybe you've just come home from a long day, the kind that leaves you tired in both body and mind. Or maybe it's your evening off, and you're simply looking for something calm and comforting. Perhaps you're a student, still carrying the hum of thoughts and lectures. Or maybe you're just lying there, hoping that sleep might come a little easier this time. Whatever the reason, I'm truly glad you're here. There's nothing you need to do now. No more decisions, no more noise. Let your shoulders drop, soften your jaw, and take a deep, gentle breath. Inhale, exhale. You're safe here, and you're not alone. My only job tonight is to stay with you, to speak softly while your eyes begin to close, and to carry your mind away from the worries of today, into the folds of time, where history waits quietly to be discovered. Tonight, we travel back to the summer of 1518, to the quiet banks of the Rhine River, to a city of timber-framed houses, bustling markets, and narrow cobblestone streets. Strasbourg, a prosperous, ordinary city, until something deeply extraordinary began to unfold. It started with one woman dancing in the street, then another, and another. Soon, dozens, and then hundreds, of people were dancing uncontrollably. Not with joy, but with something no one could quite explain. This was no festival. It was something far stranger, and far more terrifying. Tonight, we still walk those ancient streets together, witness how celebration turned to crisis, and explore how a city's spirit slowly unraveled into something no one could stop. But don't worry. I'll tell you everything, slowly, calmly, and with care. You just need to listen and drift. Let the world grow quiet around you now. Let your imagination soften the edges of today. And when you start ready, we still begin. And if this quiet story helps you rest, if you enjoy these peaceful journeys into forgotten corners of history, feel free to leave a like or subscribe. That way I can be here again tomorrow night, with another story to help you drift into sleep, one breath at a time. Segment 1. Strange Beginnings in Strasbourg. The morning of July 14th, 1518, dawned like any other in the free imperial city of Strasbourg, where the timeless rhythms of medieval life continued their ancient patterns beneath skies that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of saints, and the slow, inexorable march of human civilization along the banks of the mighty Rhine. The sun climbed slowly over the red-tiled roofs that crowned buildings whose foundations had been laid by generations of craftsmen, their architectural legacy creating a skyline that spoke of accumulated prosperity and enduring faith. Long shadows stretched across the narrow streets that had seen centuries of merchants, craftsmen, and pilgrims pass through their embrace, each generation leaving its mark on the worn stones while following pathways first traced by Roman legions and refined by medieval traders. These ancient thoroughfares had witnessed the pageantry of imperial processions, the solemnity of religious festivals, the daily drama of births and deaths, marriages and funerals, the countless small events that comprise the texture of human existence in any age. The air on this particular morning carried the mingled scents that had defined urban life for centuries, the comforting aroma of fresh bread emerging from the bakers' ovens, where guildmasters continued traditions passed down from father to son, the sharp metallic tang of the blacksmiths' forges, where iron was transformed into the tools and weapons that sustained civilization, and the ever-present, faintly marshy scent of the Rhine River that flowed just beyond the city walls, carrying trade goods and travelers from distant lands. The river itself represented both opportunity and mystery to the citizens of Strasbourg, its waters connecting their prosperous city to the broader world of European commerce, while also serving as a highway for ideas, diseases, and influences that could transform their carefully ordered existence in ways both wonderful and terrifying. Ships arrived daily bearing exotic goods from the Low Countries, spices from distant eastern markets, fine cloth from Flemish looms, and news of political upheavals, religious reforms, and natural disasters that reminded them of their place in a larger, often incomprehensible world. Imagine yourself walking through these streets in the early morning hours, your footsteps echoing softly against the worn stones that had been polished smooth by countless generations of human passage, each cobble bearing the invisible imprints of merchants hurrying to market, pilgrims seeking spiritual solace, children playing their eternal games, and lovers stealing moments of privacy in the shadows between buildings. The houses rise on either side of you, their upper stories jutting out over the street in the distinctive style of medieval architecture, creating a canopy of timber and plaster that filters the morning light into gentle dancing patterns. These buildings themselves tell stories of the families who had inhabited them for generations, their wooden beams seasoned by decades of heat and cold, their plaster walls marked by the subtle stains and scratches that accumulate when human lives unfold within confined spaces. The architectural details, carved window frames, ornate doorways, decorative brackets supporting the overhanging upper floors, represent the artistic aspirations of craftsmen who understood that beauty could transform mere shelter into something approaching art. You can hear the gradual awakening of the city, a symphony of domestic sounds that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. The creak of shutters being opened by household servants beginning their daily routines, the distant lowing of cattle being led through the streets toward pastures outside the walls, the soft murmur of early conversations drifting from open doorways where families gathered for their morning meals, the cathedral bells, those bronze voices that had marked the passage of time for generations of citizens, chimed the canonical hours with their familiar sequence of notes that organized daily life according to ancient religious traditions. This was a world where life moved at the pace of the seasons, where the rhythm of existence was measured not in the precise minutes or hours that would obsess later ages, but in the slow, organic progression of sunrise to sunset, market day to market day, feast to fast, planting to harvest. The people of Strasbourg lived their lives within the protective embrace of thick stone walls that had been raised by their ancestors and strengthened by subsequent generations, their daily routines as predictable and comforting as the turning of the great cathedral clock that marked the hours with its steady, reassuring chime. The city's walls themselves represented more than mere fortification. They defined the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between the known and the unknown, between the safety of human community and the dangers that lurked in forests and fields, where outlaws, wild beasts, and supernatural forces might threaten unwary travelers. Within these walls, citizens enjoyed the security that came from belonging to a community with established laws, recognized authorities, and time-tested traditions for maintaining order and prosperity. The social fabric of Strasbourg was woven from threads of mutual dependence and collective responsibility that bound individuals into a complex web of relationships spanning generations. Guild organizations regulated commerce and craftsmanship, ensuring quality while protecting their members' economic interests. Religious institutions provided spiritual guidance while offering practical assistance to the poor, the sick, and the unfortunate. Civic authorities maintained peace and resolved disputes through courts that balanced ancient custom with evolving legal principles. But on this particular morning, in a narrow street near the heart of the old city, where the shadows lingered longest and the ancient stones seemed to whisper of mysteries beyond human understanding, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge every assumption the citizens held about the nature of reality, the reliability of their social institutions, and the boundaries between the rational and the inexplicable. Her name was Frau Trophia, though history has preserved frustratingly little else about her identity beyond this single designation that marked her as a married or widowed woman of respectable social standing. She was, by all contemporary accounts, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in this ordinary corner of the Holy Roman Empire, her existence distinguished from countless others only by the extraordinary events that were about to transform her from anonymous citizen into the central figure of one of history's most baffling episodes. Perhaps she was a merchant's wife, managing household affairs while her husband travelled the trade routes that connected Strasbourg to distant markets in Paris, London, or the Italian city-states. Perhaps she was a widow who had inherited her late husband's business and was struggling to maintain her family's position in a society that often questioned women's ability to conduct commercial affairs independently. Perhaps she was simply a woman of middle age trying to navigate the complexities of urban life in the early 16th century, when traditional certainties were being challenged by new ideas about religion, politics, and human nature. Picture her home, which would have reflected both her social status and the architectural conventions of the period, a modest dwelling of timber and stone, its construction following patterns that had evolved over centuries to provide maximum utility within the constraints of limited space and expensive materials. The ground floor might have housed a workshop or shop if her family was engaged in commerce, while the upper floors provided living quarters arranged according to practical rather than aesthetic considerations. The rooms within would have been small by modern standards, with low ceilings supported by heavy wooden beams that bore the marks of the craftsmen who had shaped them decades or even centuries earlier. Small windows, fitted with expensive glass if the family could afford it, or covered with oiled parchment, if they could not, let in just enough light to illuminate the simple furnishings within wooden chests for storage, rough tables for meals and work, benches and stools for seating, perhaps a few chairs if the household enjoyed particular prosperity. The floors would have been of packed earth on the ground level, or rough planks on the upper stories, covered perhaps with rushes that were replaced seasonally, or simple woven mats that represented significant investments for families of modest means. The walls, constructed of thick timber filled with clay and straw, would have been whitewashed if money permitted, or left in their natural wood tones if it did not, decorated only with the most essential household items, a crucifix that proclaimed the family's Christian faith, perhaps a small shrine to the Virgin Mary, where candles could be lit during times of particular need or gratitude. The hearth would have dominated the main living space, its fire providing not only warmth during the cold months, but also the means for cooking the simple meals that sustained urban families, who could rarely afford the elaborate cuisine enjoyed by the wealthy. Iron pots and wooden utensils, carefully maintained and passed down through generations, would have represented significant family assets whose loss could create genuine hardship for households operating on narrow economic margins. On this morning, as the cathedral bells chimed the hour of prime, and the city slowly awakened to another day that promised to follow the same patterns that had defined urban life for centuries, Frau Trophäe emerged from her dwelling and began to dance, not the structured ceremonial dancing of feast days or weddings, with their prescribed steps and ritual significance that connected participants to ancient traditions of community celebration, not the careful, measured movements of religious processions, where every gesture carried theological meaning and every step honored the sacred mysteries of Christian faith. Instead, she began to move with a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her, a compulsion that defied explanation or resistance, and appeared to operate according to laws that had nothing to do with human will or social convention. Her movements were urgent and uncontrolled, driven by forces that she seemed no more able to understand than the growing crowd of observers who gathered to witness this unprecedented spectacle. The narrow street where she danced was entirely typical of Strasbourg's medieval quarters, representing centuries of organic urban development that had occurred without central planning or architectural vision. The buildings crowded close together for warmth and security, their upper stories nearly touching overhead, and creating an intimate space where neighbors knew each other's voices, where the sound of a dropped pot or a crying child would echo from house to house, where privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and most had learned to live without. It was a place where the boundaries between public and private life were fluid and permeable, where domestic activities spilled out into the street, and community affairs influenced household decisions. Children played in the narrow spaces between buildings, women gathered at communal wells to draw water and exchange news, men paused on their way to work to discuss weather, politics, or the price of grain, with neighbors whose opinions they had known and respected for decades. The cobblestones beneath Frau Trophäe's feet had been laid by craftsmen whose names were forgotten, but whose work continued to serve the community generations after their deaths. These stones, quarried from hills outside the city and fitted together with the skill that marked medieval masonry, had witnessed countless processions, markets, celebrations, and tragedies. They had been stained by the blood of martyrs, blessed by the feet of saints, worn smooth by the passage of pilgrims seeking spiritual renewal at sacred sites. As Frau Trophäe danced, her movements grew more frenzied, more desperate, as if she were struggling against invisible bonds that tightened with her efforts to break free. There was no music to guide her steps, no feast day to celebrate, no apparent joy in her motion. Instead, she moved as if driven by some invisible force that had taken possession of her body and was using it for purposes that neither she nor her observers could comprehend. Her feet struck the cobblestones with increasing intensity, the sound sharp and urgent in the morning air that had previously carried only the gentle sounds of daily awakening. The rhythm of her steps created a percussive accompaniment that seemed to echo off the narrow walls and reverberate through the enclosed space, as if the street itself had become a drum, and her feet the mallets that beat out some ancient, forgotten song. The first to notice her strange behavior were her immediate neighbors, women drawing water from the communal well, who paused in their morning routines to stare at this unprecedented display. Men preparing for their daily labor, who stopped in doorways to watch the dancing woman with expressions of growing concern. Children playing in the street before their chores began, who gathered in small groups to point and whisper about the strange lady who moved like no one they had ever seen. At first, these early witnesses might have assumed she was celebrating something, perhaps the arrival of good news about a traveling husband's safe return, the successful completion of some long-awaited business transaction, or the recovery of a family member from serious illness. Spontaneous expressions of joy, while unusual in public, were not entirely unknown in a society where emotions were generally kept under strict control, but occasionally burst forth in moments of particular happiness or relief. But as the minutes stretched into hours, as the sun climbed higher in the sky and cast shorter shadows while Frau Trophea showed no signs of stopping, no signs of fatigue or satisfaction that might indicate the completion of her celebration, their curiosity began to transform into something approaching concern, then bewilderment, and finally a deep, undefined fear that seemed to emanate from the very persistence of her inexplicable behavior. Imagine the growing crowd of onlookers, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and worry that spoke to the deeply unsettling nature of what they were witnessing. In a world where public displays of emotion were carefully regulated by social convention, where behavior was expected to conform to strict norms that had been established through centuries of communal life, where individual expression was subordinated to collective harmony, Frau Trophia's dancing represented something profoundly disturbing to the established order. It was spontaneous in a world that valued careful planning and deliberate action, individual in a society that prized conformity and group solidarity, and above all, it was unstoppable in a culture that believed human will, guided by divine grace and social pressure, could control any form of behavior that threatened community stability. The very persistence of her dancing challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature and the power of social institutions to maintain order. The medieval mind understood the world through the lens of divine will and natural order, seeing all events as part of a cosmic plan that, while often mysterious to human understanding, nevertheless operated according to principles that could be discerned through careful observation, prayer, and study of sacred texts. Everything had its place in the great chain of being, its purpose in the divine scheme, its proper time for occurrence according to the rhythms established by God at the moment of creation. Illness was often seen as a punishment for sin, whether individual transgressions or collective failures that had brought divine displeasure upon the community. Good fortune was interpreted as a reward for virtue, evidence of divine favor earned through proper behavior and faithful observance of religious obligations. Natural disasters, while terrifying, could be understood as divine warnings or corrections intended to bring errant communities back to the path of righteousness. But what was this? What category of human experience could encompass a woman dancing alone in the street, seemingly unable to control her own body, moving to music that no one else could hear, following rhythms that bore no relationship to any known form of celebration or religious observance? The very strangeness of Frau Trophia's behavior challenged the intellectual frameworks through which the citizens of Strasbourg understood their world. As the day wore on, and the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows that provided little relief from the growing heat, Frau Trophia's dancing became more erratic, more violent, as if the force that drove her was feeding on her exhaustion and growing stronger with each passing hour. Her movements, which had begun with something approaching grace, now took on a mechanical quality that was deeply disturbing to observers who had initially been drawn by curiosity, but now found themselves unable to look away from the spectacle of human will, apparently overcome by forces beyond rational explanation. Her feet began to bleed, leaving dark stains on the stones beneath her that would remain visible long after the immediate crisis had passed, creating a permanent reminder of the day when the inexplicable had manifested itself in their midst. The sight of blood, particularly blood shed through such mysterious circumstances, carried profound symbolic weight in a culture that understood life itself as a precious gift from God that should never be wasted or carelessly spilled. Her clothing became disheveled as the hours passed, her carefully arranged hair wild and unkempt, her appearance transforming from that of a respectable citizen to something approaching the popular image of madness or supernatural possession. Yet still, she could not stop. The rhythm that drove her seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour, as if feeding on her exhaustion, drawing strength from her very inability to resist, transforming her from an active participant in the dance to a passive instrument through which unseen forces expressed themselves. The crowd of watchers grew throughout the day as word spread through the narrow streets and market squares like wildfire, carried by servants running errands, merchants traveling between workshops, children sent on messages by parents who themselves were too fascinated by the spectacle to leave their posts as observers. The news that spread was simple but electrifying. Something strange was happening near the cathedral, something that defied explanation and demanded witnessing. People abandoned their daily tasks to witness this spectacle, leaving shops unattended, workshops idle, household duties undone in order to see for themselves the woman who danced as if her life depended on it, who moved with a desperation that was both captivating and terrifying. The normal routines that governed urban life, the careful scheduling of work and rest, market time and meal time, prayer time and leisure time, were disrupted by the magnetic pull of this unprecedented event. Merchants closed their stalls early, sacrificing potential profits for the opportunity to witness what many were already calling a miracle or a curse, depending on their theological inclinations. Craftsmen set aside their tools, abandoning projects that had been carefully planned and timed to meet delivery deadlines. Even servants and apprentices found excuses to linger in the street, their usual fear of punishment overcome by curiosity about events that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. By evening, when the cathedral bells chimed vespers and their bronze voices reminded the community of the eternal rhythms that governed spiritual life, when the shadows began to lengthen across the cobblestones and the heat of the day slowly gave way to the cooler temperatures of approaching night, Frau Trophia was still dancing. Her movements had become mechanical, repetitive, as if her body had surrendered completely to some external will that operated according to laws unknown to human understanding. The crowd of onlookers had grown silent, their initial curiosity and excited chatter replaced by a deep, undefined fear that seemed to emanate from the very persistence of what they were witnessing. The afternoon had brought no resolution, no explanation, no end to the dancing that continued with relentless consistency, despite the obvious physical toll it was taking on the woman who served as its unwilling instrument. In the flickering light of torches and oil lamps that were brought out as darkness gathered around the ancient city, Frau Trophia's dancing took on an almost supernatural quality that made observers question whether they were witnessing natural phenomena or something that transcended the normal boundaries of human experience. The shadows cast by her moving form seemed to writhe and dance along the walls in patterns that hurt to look at directly, creating visual effects that suggested the presence of forces beyond ordinary perception. The sound of her feet on the stones had become a constant, rhythmic percussion that seemed to pulse with its own life, like the beating of some great, invisible heart that pumped mysterious energies through the confined space of the narrow street. The rhythm was hypnotic, compelling, disturbing in ways that observers found difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The city's authorities began to take serious notice as reports reached their ears through the complex networks of communication that connected civic officials, guild leaders, and religious authorities in the governance of urban life. In Strasbourg, as in most medieval cities, public order was maintained through a carefully balanced system of competing jurisdictions and overlapping responsibilities that required constant negotiation and cooperation among various power centers. The Rat, or City Council, composed of wealthy merchants and guild leaders who had achieved political prominence through commercial success and civic involvement, was responsible for maintaining peace and prosperity within the walls. These men prided themselves on their practical wisdom, their ability to handle any crisis through the application of time-tested administrative procedures, and their authority to mobilize the resources necessary to address threats to public order. But this was something new, something that didn't fit into their established categories of problems or their repertoire of solutions. Was it a medical issue that required the attention of physicians trained in the classical traditions of healing, a religious matter that fell under the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical authorities, a question of public order that demanded intervention by civic officials? The very ambiguity of Frau Trophi's condition created jurisdictional confusion that complicated efforts to respond effectively. As night fell on July 14, 1518, the authorities gathered in hushed consultation in the council chambers, their usual confidence shaken by reports of events that challenged their understanding of the world they governed. Through the windows of their meeting room, They could hear the distant but persistent sound of feet striking cobblestones, a rhythmic reminder that the crisis they were discussing continued to unfold just beyond their walls. The physicians who were summoned to provide expert advice represented the most advanced medical knowledge available in the early 16th century, men trained in the classical traditions of Galen and Hippocrates, whose theoretical frameworks had dominated European medicine for over a millennium. They spoke learnedly of humoral imbalances, of excess blood creating heat in the brain that might manifest as uncontrolled movement, of the possible influence of planetary alignments on human behavior and bodily functions. Their explanations drew upon centuries of accumulated medical wisdom that interpreted physical symptoms as manifestations of underlying imbalances in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose proper proportion was essential for health and whose disruption could cause various forms of illness. They discussed the possibility that Frotrophy's dancing might result from an excess of sanguine humor, causing overheating of the brain and loss of rational control over bodily functions. But their theoretical knowledge, however sophisticated and internally consistent, seemed inadequate in the face of the raw, physical reality unfolding in the street outside. Their traditional treatments, bloodletting to reduce excess humors, purging to eliminate corrupted substances from the body, the application of cooling herbs to reduce internal heat, appeared to have no effect on the dancing woman who continued her relentless movement, despite their learned interventions. The clergy, meanwhile, engaged in their own debates about the theological significance of what they were witnessing, drawing upon centuries of Christian teaching about the relationship between spiritual and physical phenomena. Some argued that this was clearly a case of divine punishment, perhaps for some hidden sin that had brought God's displeasure upon the community, or upon Frau Trophäa individually. Others suggested the possibility of diabolic possession, pointing to the uncontrolled nature of her movements as evidence of demonic influence. They offered prayers for her recovery, performed blessings over the stones where she danced, sprinkled holy water on the narrow street, in hopes of cleansing whatever spiritual contamination might be present. But the sacred rituals that had comforted the faithful for centuries, that had provided reliable means of addressing spiritual crises and supernatural threats, seemed powerless against whatever force had taken hold of Frau Trophäa. The failure of both medical and religious interventions to provide relief created a growing sense of helplessness among the authorities, who were accustomed to finding solutions to the problems that arose within their jurisdiction. Their established methods of maintaining order and protecting public welfare appeared inadequate to address phenomena that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to human learning. As the night deepened and the torches burned lower, as most of the crowd finally began to disperse to their homes, where they would lie awake discussing what they had witnessed, Frau Trophäa danced on with mechanical persistence that had become more disturbing than any display of emotion or desperation. Alone now in the narrow street, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon and the distant glow of candles burning in the cathedral windows, she moved with a rhythm that seemed to have become part of the very fabric of the city. The sound of her feet on the stones echoed through the empty streets, a solitary percussion that seemed to call out to something hidden in the darkness, something that lurked just beyond the edge of human perception, but was gradually being awakened by the persistent rhythm of her dance. The medieval imagination, shaped by centuries of Christian teaching about the reality of supernatural forces, could not help but interpret these sounds as a summons to powers that were better left undisturbed. And in houses throughout Strasbourg, as people lay in their beds and listened to that steady, unrelenting rhythm that penetrated walls and shutters to reach their ears, something deep within them began to stir in response. The sound was hypnotic, compelling, impossible to ignore, despite their desire to sleep and forget what they had witnessed. Some found themselves moving their feet in unconscious rhythm with the distant percussion. Others discovered that melodies were forming in their minds to accompany the beat that continued through the night. By dawn of the second day, as the cathedral bells chimed lauds and their familiar bronze voices called the faithful to morning prayer, as the first light of sunrise began to illuminate the narrow streets and reveal the extent of what had occurred during the dark hours, Frau Trophäa was no longer dancing alone. 3 other women had joined her in the street, their movements just as frenzied, just as uncontrollable, their faces showing the same expression of helpless compulsion that had marked Frau Trophäa's features since the beginning of her ordeal. These new dancers had emerged from their homes during the night, drawn by the irresistible rhythm that had penetrated their dreams and overcome their will to resist. They moved with the same mechanical precision, the same desperate energy, the same apparent inability to stop or control their actions. Their feet struck the cobblestones in synchronization with Frotrophia's, creating a compound rhythm that was even more hypnotic and disturbing than the solitary percussion that had marked the first day. And in the growing light of morning, as the cathedral bells continued their ancient call to prayer, and the city slowly awakened to the realization that the crisis had not ended with the night, the people of Strasbourg began to understand that something far more serious than a single woman's mysterious affliction was beginning to unfold within their walls. The dance, it seemed, was spreading with the inexorable progress of a plague, moving from individual to individual through mechanisms that defied medical understanding or religious explanation. With each new dancer who joined the growing crowd in the street, the rhythm grew stronger, more insistent, more impossible to resist for those who heard it and felt its pull upon their own bodies and minds. The town that had prided itself on order and prosperity, that had built its identity around rational governance and successful commerce, was about to learn that some forces are beyond human control, that some mysteries are too deep for rational explanation, that some challenges cannot be met through the application of traditional wisdom or established procedures. As we pause here in our story, imagine yourself as one of those early witnesses, standing in the growing crowd of onlookers, watching as your familiar world begins to transform into something strange and frightening. Feel the weight of the morning air, heavy with the scent of summer heat that promises another day of relentless sun, tinged with the metallic smell of blood from the dancers' wounded feet, and the acrid smoke from torches that have burned through the night. Listen to the sound of those relentless feet on the ancient stones, a rhythm that seems to pulse with its own dark life, calling to something deep within your own body that wants to respond, wants to join the dance, despite your rational mind's understanding that this would mean surrendering control over your own actions and submitting to forces that you cannot understand or resist. The dancing plague of Strasbourg was just beginning, and before it ended, it would challenge every assumption the citizens held about the nature of reality, the power of human will, and the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective madness. The narrow street where Frau Trophea had begun her solitary dance would become the epicenter of a phenomenon that would spread throughout the city, claiming dozens of victims and leaving authorities struggling to understand and control forces that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to human science or divine revelation. The second day brought with it a heat that seemed to press down upon the city, like a heavy blanket woven from the accumulated weight of divine displeasure or supernatural malevolence, depending upon one's theological inclinations and capacity for rational explanation. The July sun climbed steadily over the red-tiled roofs that crowned centuries-old buildings, its rays striking the narrow streets with an intensity that transformed the familiar pathways of daily life into furnaces of reflected heat that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible. Harsh shadows formed between the buildings like dark rivers of coolness that provided only temporary relief for those brave enough to venture close to the dancing epidemic that had begun to consume their city. The oppressive warmth filled the narrow streets with a thick, suffocating atmosphere that seemed to intensify the psychological pressure already building within the community, as citizens struggled to understand events that challenged every framework they possessed for making sense of their world. In the countryside beyond Strasbourg's protective walls, the grain stood parched and yellowing in fields that should have been green with the promise of abundant harvest, another reminder of the difficult season that awaited the region's struggling farmers who had already endured 2 years of poor weather and reduced yields. The agricultural distress that had plagued the region for months seemed to mirror the urban crisis that was now unfolding within the city's walls, as if the natural and supernatural worlds had conspired to test the faith and endurance of all who called this corner of the Holy Roman Empire their home. But within the city walls, attention had turned entirely away from concerns about distant harvests and future prosperity, to focus with growing alarm on the small but expanding group of women who continued their relentless dance in the street near the cathedral, where the ancient stones had witnessed centuries of human drama, but nothing quite as strange or disturbing as what was now unfolding beneath the watchful eyes of carved saints and martyrs, whose stone faces seemed to regard the proceedings with expressions of eternal disapproval. What had begun as a single woman's mysterious affliction, an individual tragedy that might have been contained through medical intervention or religious healing, had now become something far more disturbing and potentially catastrophic. By the morning of July 15th, when the cathedral bells chimed lauds and their bronze voices called the faithful to morning prayer, 7 people moved in that strange, desperate rhythm that had replaced normal human behavior with something approaching mechanical automation. Their feet struck the cobblestones with a sound that had become as constant and unnerving as the flow of the Rhine itself, creating a percussive symphony that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The rhythm was hypnotic, compelling, impossible to ignore, despite the desires of observers who found themselves unconsciously matching their own heartbeats to the relentless tempo that echoed through the narrow streets and penetrated the walls of surrounding buildings. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the growing crowd of spectators, feeling the morning heat begin to build against your skin like the breath of some great furnace, while the oppressive atmosphere created by the dancing epidemic seems to press down upon your consciousness with almost physical weight. The air is thick with dust kicked up by the dancers' feet, creating a haze that makes the scene appear dreamlike and unreal, as if you were witnessing events through a veil that separated the rational world from some realm of nightmare and impossibility. You can smell the sharp, acrid tang of perspiration that speaks of bodies pushed beyond their normal limits, the metallic scent of blood from wounds that refuse to heal despite the ministrations of skilled physicians, and underneath it all, the underlying aroma of fear that has begun to permeate the gathering crowd like incense burning in some unholy temple. The very air seems contaminated by the presence of forces that operate according to laws unknown to human understanding. The dancers themselves had begun to take on a haunting uniformity that was perhaps more disturbing than their individual afflictions had been, suggesting that whatever force controlled them was growing stronger and more organized with each passing hour. Their movements, while individual in their specific gestures and personal expressions, followed the same inexorable rhythm that seemed to emanate from some source beyond the physical world, binding them together in a collective madness that transcended ordinary human experience. They seemed to exist in a world apart from the watchers, their eyes unfocused and staring, their faces bearing expressions of terrible concentration that suggested they were listening to music that no one else could hear or responding to commands that originated from realms beyond human perception. Their expressions combined elements of ecstasy and agony in ways that made observers uncomfortable, as if they were witnessing something too intimate and profound for public viewing. Some of the dancers moved with their arms extended as if embracing invisible partners. Others spun in place with their faces turned toward the sky, as if seeking divine guidance or supernatural instruction. Still others performed intricate steps that seemed to trace complex patterns on the ancient stones, patterns that hurt to look at directly and suggested meanings that the rational mind could not quite grasp but instinctively recognized as significant and dangerous. Master Johann Tannheimer, one of the city's most respected physicians, and a man whose reputation for learning extended throughout the region, had arrived at dawn to examine the afflicted more closely, bringing with him the accumulated wisdom of decades spent studying the mysteries of human health and disease. A man of considerable learning and intellectual achievement, educated at the prestigious University of Paris, and well-versed in the medical traditions of both classical antiquity and the Islamic world, he approached the unprecedented phenomenon with the methodical precision that had made him successful in his profession. Yet even his extensive training, his mastery of the theoretical frameworks that had guided European medicine for centuries, seemed inadequate to explain what he witnessed in the narrow street, where reality appeared to have surrendered to forces that recognized no natural law. His previous experience with cases of madness, possession, and various forms of mental disturbance provided no precedent for the organized, collective nature of what he was observing. "The humours," he muttered to his assistant, a young man named Georg, who carried the physician's leather satchel filled with the instruments and remedies that represented the cutting edge of early 16th century medical technology. Clearly an excess of blood has created heat in the brain, driving these poor souls to this frenzy. The sanguine humour, when overheated by external influences, can indeed cause uncontrolled movement and loss of rational faculties. His words carried the authority of established medical doctrine, drawing upon the classical theories of Galen and Hippocrates that had dominated European understanding of human physiology for over a millennium. The humoral theory provided a comprehensive framework for understanding disease as the result of imbalances among the 4 fundamental substances that governed bodily functions: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And yet, he paused in his diagnostic pronouncement, watching with growing perplexity as one of the dancers, a woman of perhaps 30 years whose social standing was indicated by the quality of her clothing despite its current disheveled state, spun in place with her arms extended, her face turned toward the sky as if in communion with celestial forces, and yet, the traditional treatments seemed to have no effect whatsoever upon the progression of the affliction. Master Tannheimer had attempted bloodletting on 2 of the dancers during the previous evening, opening veins in their arms with the practiced precision that marked skilled medical practitioners, allowing the corrupted blood to flow from their bodies in quantities that should have reduced the excess sanguine humor responsible for their condition. The blood had flowed dark and thick, exactly as his theoretical understanding predicted, but the dancing had continued unabated, as if the force that drove their movements operated independently of their physical bodies. He had administered purging herbs, designed to eliminate corrupted substances from the digestive system, applied cooling compresses to reduce the internal heat that supposedly caused their frenzied behavior, and even attempted to restrain one of the afflicted women with soft leather bonds that would prevent movement without causing injury. Nothing had worked. Every intervention that medical science could suggest had proven ineffective against whatever force had taken control of these unfortunate souls. The failure of established medical procedures to provide relief created a profound sense of professional frustration and intellectual confusion for a man who had built his reputation upon his ability to diagnose and treat the full range of human ailments. Master Tannheimer found himself confronting the possibility that he was witnessing phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of natural philosophy, that operated according to laws unknown to human learning. The crowd of watchers continued to grow throughout the morning, fed by an unstoppable flow of curious citizens who abandoned their daily routines to witness what many were already calling the most extraordinary event in their city's long history. Word of the dancing plague had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood through the complex networks of communication that connected all corners of the urban community, carried by servants running errands, merchants traveling between workshops, and children sent on messages by parents too fascinated by the unfolding drama to leave their posts as observers. Merchants abandoned their stalls in the main market square, sacrificing potential profits for the opportunity to witness events that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. Craftsmen left their workshops with projects half finished, their usual dedication to their trades, overcome by curiosity about phenomena that challenged everything they thought they understood about human nature and divine will. Even members of the city's more prosperous families, those who normally avoided the crowded streets and public spectacles that characterized urban life, emerged from their comfortable homes to witness this unprecedented display. Among the onlookers was Frau Margarete Kohler, the wife of a successful cloth merchant whose business connections extended throughout the Rhine Valley, and whose social position marked her as one of Strasbourg's more prominent citizens. She had arrived with her 2 teenage daughters in tow, Clara and Anne, despite her husband's concerns about exposing young women to scenes that might prove disturbing or morally corrupting. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her fine woolen dress, dyed with expensive colors that proclaimed her family's prosperity, creating a stark contrast to the simpler garments of the working people around her. The quality of her clothing, the careful arrangement of her hair beneath a respectable head covering, and the confident bearing that marked those accustomed to social prominence, all served to distinguish her from the common citizens who made up the majority of the watching crowd. Her daughters, Clara and Anne, pressed close to their mother's sides with the instinctive caution of young women who had been raised to understand the importance of maintaining proper behavior in public situations. Their eyes, however, were wide with a mixture of fascination and fear that reflected their struggle to process what they were witnessing within the framework of their carefully sheltered upbringing. "Why do they dance, Mama?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the constant sound of feet striking stone, her question carrying all the confusion and concern that the unfolding crisis had created throughout the community. At 16, she was old enough to understand that what she was witnessing was unprecedented and disturbing, yet too young to possess the intellectual framework necessary to make sense of events that challenged adult understanding. Frau Kohler had no answer for her daughter's question, despite her education, her social connections, and her experience with the broader world beyond Strasbourg's walls. In her carefully ordered existence of household management, social obligations, and commercial oversight. There was no category for what she was witnessing, no precedent that could help her explain to her daughters why respected members of their community had been transformed into something approaching wild animals or supernatural creatures. She had attended countless feast days and religious celebrations, had watched the carefully choreographed dances of weddings and guild festivals, had participated in the structured movements of religious processions, where every gesture carried theological meaning and every step honored the sacred mysteries of Christian faith. But this was something else entirely, something that seemed to mock the very idea of controlled, purposeful movement, while suggesting the presence of forces that operated beyond human will or divine blessing. The dancing she was witnessing bore no relationship to any form of human expression she had previously encountered. It was neither celebration nor mourning, neither worship nor entertainment, but something that seemed to exist in a category all its own, something that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which her understanding of proper behavior was based. As the day progressed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows and intensifying the oppressive heat that made observation increasingly uncomfortable, the number of dancers continued to grow with a regularity that suggested some underlying pattern or progression. By midday, when the cathedral bells chimed sext and their familiar bronze voices reminded the community of the eternal rhythms that govern spiritual life, 15 people moved in that terrible rhythm that had replaced human consciousness with something approaching mechanical automation. They came from all walks of life, representing a cross-section of Strasbourg's urban population that defied any simple explanation based on social class, economic status, or religious devotion. Among the afflicted were merchants' wives, whose comfortable circumstances should have protected them from the stresses that might drive common people to such extremes, domestic servants, whose lives of hard labor might have made them susceptible to physical breakdown, skilled craftsmen, whose guild memberships provided them with security and social standing, and laborers whose daily struggles with poverty and uncertainty might have created the desperation that could manifest as uncontrolled movement. The city's authorities watched the growing epidemic with mounting alarm that reflected their recognition that they were facing something far beyond their previous experience with urban crises. Master Heinrich Ingold, the Ammeister or chief magistrate whose authority encompassed all aspects of civic governance, had convened an emergency session of the city council in response to reports that made clear the unprecedented nature of the challenge facing their community. They gathered in the stone-walled chamber of the Rathaus, the city hall whose architecture proclaimed Strasbourg's prosperity and whose history encompassed centuries of important decisions about trade, taxation, defense, and the countless other matters that required attention from civic leaders. The chamber itself, with its vaulted ceiling and tall windows that provided natural illumination for their deliberations, had witnessed debates about plague outbreaks, food shortages, military threats, and economic crises, but none of the council members had ever faced anything quite like the situation that now demanded their attention. The oak table around which they gathered had been carved from trees that grew in the forests surrounding Strasbourg, decades before any of them were born, its surface bearing the subtle marks and stains that accumulated when important decisions were made in its presence. The chairs in which they sat had been occupied by their predecessors, men who had guided the city through previous crises with varying degrees of success, establishing precedents and traditions that normally provided guidance for addressing unprecedented challenges. "It spreads like a contagion," reported Master Friedrich Brandt, the city's chief constable, whose responsibilities included maintaining public order and investigating unusual occurrences that might threaten community security. His weathered face bore the marks of decades spent dealing with the practical challenges of urban law enforcement. But the current crisis had shaken his confidence in ways that ordinary criminal activity never could. Each day brings new dancers, and those already afflicted show no signs of recovery, despite the efforts of our most skilled physicians. The medical men are completely baffled by what they observe. The clergy speak of divine judgment or demonic influence without reaching any consensus about appropriate responses, and the people grow more frightened with each passing hour as they realize that no one in authority possesses the knowledge necessary to address this crisis. The council members, dressed in their formal robes of office that marked their status as the elected representatives of Strasbourg's guilds and trading interests, exchanged worried glances that spoke of their shared recognition that they were confronting something far beyond their previous experience. These were practical men, successful merchants and craftsmen who had achieved political prominence through their demonstrated ability to solve problems and manage complex situations that required both wisdom and decisive action. They understood how to handle plague outbreaks through quarantine measures and improved sanitation, how to address food shortages through careful management of grain reserves and trade relationships, how to maintain civic peace during periods of economic stress or religious controversy. They had successfully managed the transition from medieval guild governance to more modern forms of municipal administration, balancing the competing interests of different social classes while maintaining Strasbourg's position as one of the most prosperous cities in the Holy Roman Empire. But this dancing mania fell completely outside their accumulated experience and expertise, presenting challenges that seemed to require knowledge they did not possess, and solutions that might not exist within the realm of human capability. The very nature of the crisis seemed to mock their assumption that rational analysis and practical action could address any problem that threatened their community's welfare. Perhaps, suggested Master Wilhelm Korn, the guild representative for the bakers whose responsibilities included ensuring adequate food supplies for the urban population, we should consult the scholars at the cathedral school. Surely men of learning, trained in both natural philosophy and theological investigation, can provide explanations for what the physicians cannot understand, and recommend courses of action that might prove more effective than our current approaches. His suggestion reflected the medieval assumption that learning could provide solutions to even the most mysterious problems, that the accumulated wisdom of centuries of scholarship contained frameworks for understanding any phenomenon that might occur within God's creation. The cathedral school represented the highest level of intellectual achievement available in their community, home to men who had studied at the great universities of Europe and who possessed expertise in the full range of medieval knowledge. But even as they debated the merits of various approaches to understanding and addressing the crisis, the situation in the streets was deteriorating, with a speed that suggested whatever force was responsible for the dancing plague was growing stronger and more aggressive in its assault upon their community. The dancers had begun to form a rough circle in the small square near the cathedral, their movements creating a kind of human whirlpool that drew the eye and held it with hypnotic power that made extended observation both compelling and deeply disturbing. The sound of their feet had become a constant percussion that seemed to pulse through the very stones of the city, creating vibrations that could be felt as well as heard by those who remained in the vicinity for extended periods. The rhythm had taken on qualities that transcended mere noise, becoming something approaching music in its complexity and organization, yet music of a kind that no human composer had ever created, and no earthly instrument could produce. And then, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, and the shadows started to lengthen across the square, where the dancing continued with undiminished intensity, something unprecedented happened that would be remembered as one of the most tragically misguided decisions in the city's long history. The authorities, in their desperation to find some solution to a crisis that threatened to consume their entire community, made a choice that would transform a serious situation into an uncontrollable catastrophe. "If they must dance," declared Master Ingold, his voice carrying the authority of his office, and the confidence of a man accustomed to having his decisions implemented without question, then let them dance properly. Perhaps what these poor souls need is music, proper instruction, a way to channel this mysterious energy into something more controlled and ultimately more manageable. The decision was made with the best of intentions, reflecting the council's understanding of dance as a social activity that could be regulated and controlled through the application of professional skill and established cultural traditions. Drawing upon their observation of dance at festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations, they reasoned that the chaotic, uncontrolled movements of the afflicted could be transformed into something more orderly and ultimately more beneficial through the application of professional musicians and proper choreographic guidance. They hired a group of musicians from the city's professional guild, skilled players of drums, pipes, and stringed instruments, whose expertise had provided entertainment for Strasbourg's most important celebrations, and whose reputations extended throughout the region. These men possessed the technical skill and cultural knowledge necessary to provide appropriate musical accompaniment for any form of social dancing, from the simple folk dances enjoyed by common citizens to the elaborate court dances favored by the wealthy. The musicians arrived in the late afternoon, their instruments gleaming in the slanted sunlight that filtered through the summer air with a quality that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. They were led by Master Johannes Riedel, a man of considerable reputation, whose musical abilities had earned him patronage from some of the most prominent families in the city, and whose professional confidence was based upon decades of successful performance in situations that required both technical skill and social sensitivity. Master Riedel approached the unprecedented task with the professional confidence that had made him successful throughout his career, certain that his musical expertise could bring order to chaos through the application of proper rhythm, melody, and harmonic structure. His experience with various forms of social disorder, drunken celebrations that had gotten out of hand, religious festivals that had become too enthusiastic, wedding parties that had exceeded appropriate bounds, had taught him that music could indeed influence human behavior in predictable and beneficial ways. "A simple galliard should suffice for our purposes," he told his fellow musicians as they tuned their instruments with the careful attention to detail that marked professional performers. "Something with a clear, steady beat that will be easy for them to follow, combined with a melody that suggests order and control rather than frenzy and chaos. Once they begin to move in time with our music, we can gradually slow the tempo and bring them to a natural conclusion that will allow them to rest and recover their normal consciousness." His plan reflected both musical expertise and psychological insight, based upon his understanding of how rhythm and melody could influence human emotion and behavior. The galliard, a popular dance form that combined energetic movement with structured patterns, seemed ideal for providing the afflicted with an outlet for their compulsive behavior, while gradually leading them toward calm and recovery. At the moment the first notes sounded, carrying across the square with crystalline clarity that seemed to penetrate not only the air, but the very consciousness of everyone present, something extraordinary and terrible happened, that transformed the crisis from a serious local problem into a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The dancers, who had been moving in their individual rhythms according to some internal compulsion that defied outside influence, suddenly synchronized their movements with a precision that suggested supernatural coordination. The music, rather than calming them as the authorities had hoped and expected, seemed to energize them in ways that were both immediate and profound, giving focus and intensity to their frenzied motion, while amplifying whatever force had originally taken control of their bodies. Their movements became more violent, more coordinated, more obviously beyond their conscious control, as the external rhythm provided a framework for their internal compulsions to express themselves more fully. And more disturbing still, the sound of the instruments seemed to call to something deep within the watching crowd, awakening responses that had previously been suppressed by fear, social conditioning, or simple lack of external stimulus. As the drums beat with martial intensity, and the pipes wailed with voices that seemed to speak of realms beyond human experience, more people began to join the dance with a spontaneity that was both shocking and terrifying to observe. At first it was just one or two individuals who stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers, their movements tentative and uncertain, as if they were struggling against their own rational understanding of appropriate behavior. But as the music continued, as the rhythm grew stronger and more insistent, as the melody wove patterns that seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some deeper level of human consciousness, the compulsion spread like ripples on a pond disturbed by stones thrown from some unseen hand. Frau Margaretti Kohler watched in growing horror, as her daughter Clara suddenly broke away from her protective grasp and stepped into the circle of dancers with movements that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The girl's face bore the same expression of terrible concentration that marked all the afflicted, her eyes unfocused and staring as if she were seeing visions that existed beyond the physical world, her body moving to a rhythm that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the musicians who had triggered her transformation. "Clara," Frau Kohler cried, reaching out desperately to pull her daughter back from whatever force had claimed her, her voice carrying all the anguish of a mother watching her child disappear into realms beyond reach or understanding. But the girl was already lost to the dance, her movements becoming more frenzied with each passing moment, as the music provided structure for compulsions that had previously been held in check by social conditioning and family affection. And to her mother's growing horror and helpless recognition of her own vulnerability, she felt the same compulsion beginning to stir within her own body, a response to the music that seemed to bypass all rational thought and speak directly to some primitive level of consciousness that recognized no authority save the rhythm that pulsed through the summer air. Her feet began to move despite her conscious will to remain still, her body swaying in time with the music, despite her desperate desire to resist whatever force was attempting to claim her as well. The musicians, realizing with growing alarm that their intervention was making the situation infinitely worse rather than better, began to play more softly in hopes of reducing whatever effect their music was having upon the crowd. When this failed to diminish the intensity of the dancing or slow the recruitment of new victims, they stopped playing altogether, their instruments falling silent as they recognized the catastrophic nature of their well-intentioned mistake. But the damage had already been done in ways that seemed irreversible and potentially catastrophic for the entire community. The number of dancers had swollen to nearly 50 during the brief period when music had been provided, and the compulsion seemed to have taken on a life of its own that operated independently of any external stimulus. The dance had become self-sustaining, feeding on its own energy, growing stronger with each new victim it claimed, while following patterns that seemed to transcend human understanding. As evening approached, and the shadows began to lengthen across the square, where the nightmare continued to unfold with relentless persistence, the true scope of the catastrophe became clear to anyone with eyes to see and intelligence to comprehend what they were witnessing. What had begun as a single woman's mysterious affliction had become a full-scale epidemic, a contagion that spread not through physical contact or contaminated air, but through some deeper, more mysterious mechanism that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to human science or divine revelation. The dance had become something far more than collective madness or mass hysteria. It had transformed into a force that seemed to possess its own intelligence and purpose, recruiting new victims with methodical precision while maintaining its hold over those it had already claimed. The watchers, those who had managed to resist the compulsion through luck, strong will, or simple physical distance from the epicenter of the crisis, began to disperse as darkness fell, returning to their homes with troubled hearts and minds filled with questions that had no answers. They spoke in hushed whispers as they made their way through streets that seemed somehow changed by the events they had witnessed, sharing their fears and concerns with family members who had been fortunate enough to avoid direct exposure to whatever force had transformed their neighbors into something barely recognizable as human. In the narrow streets and market squares, in the workshops and taverns where citizens normally gathered to discuss the mundane concerns of daily life, the same questions were asked again and again with growing urgency and decreasing hope of finding satisfactory answers. What was happening to their city? What force had taken hold of their friends and neighbors with such devastating effectiveness? What did the crisis mean for their understanding of the world and their place within it? And most frightening of all, who would be next to fall victim to whatever supernatural or natural force was systematically dismantling the social fabric of their community? By the third day, July 16th, when the cathedral bells chimed lauds and attempted to restore some sense of normal temporal rhythm to a community whose sense of reality had been shattered, the number of dancers had reached nearly 100 souls, who moved with mechanical precision that suggested the complete surrender of human will to forces beyond comprehension or resistance. They filled the square completely, their movements creating a chaotic symphony of sound and motion that could be heard from blocks away and felt through the soles of the feet by anyone who stood upon the same stones that had become the stage for this unprecedented drama. The city's authorities, finally recognizing that their attempt to control the situation through the application of music had transformed a serious crisis into an uncontrollable catastrophe, banned all music from the affected area, and posted guards around the perimeter to prevent curious onlookers from getting too close to whatever force was consuming their fellow citizens. The guards themselves, seasoned men who had maintained order during previous emergencies, found themselves deeply unsettled by what they were required to observe in the course of their duties. But the dance continued with undiminished intensity, driven now by its own internal rhythm that seemed to have achieved independence from any external influence. The afflicted moved in patterns that seemed to follow some hidden logic that human intelligence could not penetrate, their steps tracing invisible designs on the ancient stones that hurt to look at directly. Some danced alone, lost in their individual struggles with compulsions that seemed to originate from sources beyond their own consciousness. Others moved in groups, their movements synchronized in ways that defied explanation based upon any known form of human communication or coordination. The collective dance had taken on qualities that transcended individual madness to become something approaching a new form of existence that operated according to laws unknown to human experience. As we pause here in our unfolding story, imagine yourself as one of those early witnesses who watched in growing horror as their familiar world transformed into something strange and frightening that challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of reality and human consciousness. Picture the square filled with dancing figures whose movements create a hypnotic pattern that hurts to look at directly, yet proves impossible to ignore. Completely, their collective motion suggesting the presence of forces that operate beyond the boundaries of natural law. Feel the oppressive heat of the July sun beating down on the cobblestones with an intensity that seems to amplify the psychological pressure created by events that transcend ordinary understanding, while dust rises from hundreds of feet striking the ground in endless repetition, creates a haze that makes the entire scene appear dreamlike and unreal. Listen to the sound of those relentless feet on the ancient stones, a rhythm that seems to pulse with its own dark life while calling to something deep within your own body that wants to respond despite your rational mind's understanding that this would mean surrendering control over your own actions. The dancing plague of Strasbourg had entered its most dangerous and incomprehensible phase, transforming from a local curiosity into a crisis that threatened the very foundations of urban civilization. What had begun as a single woman's mysterious affliction had become a full-scale epidemic that challenged every assumption the community held about human nature, divine will, and the reliability of the natural order that governed their daily existence. The rhythm of the dance had become the rhythm of the city itself, a pulse that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the ancient streets, while penetrating the walls of buildings and the consciousness of citizens who had thus far managed to resist its call. And in the growing darkness of the summer night, as the dancers continued their relentless motion under stars that seemed to regard their struggles with cosmic indifference, the people of Strasbourg began to realize that they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world and their place within it. Segment 3. Deadly Remedies. The fourth day dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds hanging low over the city like a funeral shroud, woven from the accumulated grief and bewilderment of a community that had watched its familiar world transform into something unrecognizable and terrifying. The sky itself seemed to reflect the psychological state of Strasbourg's citizens, pressing down upon the ancient streets with a weight that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible. The air itself seemed thick and viscous, as if the very atmosphere had been contaminated by the supernatural forces that had taken hold of the city's population. Each breath required conscious effort, carrying with it not only the oppressive humidity that preceded summer storms, but also the scent of impending rain mixed with something far more disturbing, a subtle undertone of exhaustion and despair that had begun to permeate the very stones of Strasbourg's ancient streets, seeping into the mortar between cobblestones and rising from the earth like vapors from some underground realm of torment. The morning light, filtered through the heavy clouds that obscured the sun, cast everything in shades of grey that seemed to drain colour and vitality from the familiar landmarks that had defined the city's character for centuries. The cathedral spires, normally golden in the morning light, appeared dark and forbidding against the lowering sky. The red-tiled roofs that crowned the merchants' houses looked dull and lifeless, as if the very buildings were mourning the transformation of their city into something alien and hostile to human habitation. In the square near the cathedral, where this nightmare had first manifested itself through the mysterious compulsion that had seized Frotrophia days earlier, the dance continued without pause or variation, having achieved a momentum that seemed independent of the individuals who served as its unwilling instruments. The number of afflicted had swollen to nearly 200 souls, their movements creating a sea of human motion that rippled and flowed like water disturbed by invisible currents that followed laws unknown to natural philosophy. The collective dance had taken on qualities that transcended individual madness to become something approaching a new form of existence, an alternative reality that operated according to principles that challenged every assumption the medieval mind had made about the relationship between body and soul, between human will and divine authority, between the natural and supernatural worlds. The dancers moved in patterns that suggested both chaos and order, individual compulsion and collective purpose, creating visual effects that were simultaneously mesmerizing and deeply disturbing to observe. The sound of their feet on the cobblestones had become a constant roar that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, as if the very foundations of the city were participating in this cosmic disruption of natural order. The percussion created by hundreds of pairs of feet striking stone in endless repetition had achieved a volume and complexity that transcended mere noise to become something approaching music, but music of a kind that no human composer had ever conceived and no earthly instrument could produce. The rhythm pulsed through the ground with such intensity that it could be felt through the soles of the feet by anyone who stood within several blocks of the epicenter, rising through the stones and into the bones of those who dared to listen, creating physical sensations that were both compelling and deeply unsettling. The vibrations seemed to bypass conscious thought and speak directly to some primitive level of human consciousness that recognized the rhythm as significant yet could not understand its meaning or resist its call. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of this human maelstrom, trying to maintain your balance as the ground beneath your feet thrums with the collective impact of the dancers' relentless motion. The air around you is thick with dust raised by their movement, creating a haze that makes the entire scene appear dreamlike and unreal, as if you were witnessing events through a veil that separated the rational world from some realm of nightmare and impossibility. You can feel the vibrations travel up through the ground and into your own body, creating a physical connection to the dancers that is both intimate and terrifying. The sensation suggests that the boundary between observer and participant is more fragile than you had previously imagined, that the force responsible for the dancing plague might claim you as well, if you remain too long in its presence or allow its rhythm to penetrate too deeply into your consciousness. The air is thick with dust, and the salt tang of perspiration that speaks of bodies pushed far beyond their normal limits. But underneath these familiar scents lies something more disturbing and difficult to identify. The metallic odor of blood from wounds that refuse to heal, despite the ministrations of skilled physicians, mingles with the sour smell of exhaustion that emanates from bodies that have been dancing for days without rest or nourishment. Most unsettling of all is the indefinable aroma of fear that has begun to cling to the city like morning mist. A psychological contamination that seems to emanate from the collective terror of a community that has watched its most fundamental assumptions about reality dissolve before their eyes. This scent of fear has a quality that transcends ordinary human anxiety, suggesting the presence of something that operates beyond the normal boundaries of earthly experience. The dancers themselves had begun to show the devastating physical toll of their relentless motion, in ways that were both heartbreaking and horrifying to witness. Their clothes, once neat and proper garments that proclaimed their social status and personal dignity, now hung in tatters from their bodies like the rags worn by the poorest beggars who haunted the city's gates. The fabric had been torn by the violence of their movements, stained by sweat and blood, reduced to fragments that provided neither warmth nor modesty. Their feet, those instruments of their unwilling devotion to whatever force had claimed them, had become masses of raw flesh and exposed bone that left dark stains wherever they touched the ancient stones. The sight of these wounds was particularly disturbing, because the dancers seemed oblivious to the pain that should have been excruciating, continuing their motion despite injuries that would have incapacitated ordinary individuals and forced them to seek immediate medical attention. Dark stains marked their passage across the stones, creating patterns that seemed to follow some hidden geometry that existed beyond human understanding, some design that hurt to contemplate directly yet seemed to possess significance that the rational mind could sense without being able to comprehend. These bloodstains formed spirals and intersecting lines that suggested mathematical relationships too complex for casual observation to decode, creating a visual record of the dance that was both beautiful and terrifying. Master Johann Tannheimer, the city's chief physician, and a man whose reputation for medical expertise extended throughout the Rhine Valley, had established a makeshift treatment center in the nearby monastery of St. Thomas, hoping that the sacred environment might provide some protection against whatever forces were responsible for the dancing plague. The cool stone corridors of the monastery, once filled with the peaceful murmur of monastic prayer and the gentle sounds of contemplative life, now echoed with the groans of the afflicted and the urgent consultations of medical men who found themselves facing phenomena that challenged every principle of their training. The monastery itself, founded centuries earlier by devout Christians who had dedicated their lives to prayer and service, had never witnessed anything like the scenes that now unfolded within its sacred walls. The ancient stones that had absorbed generations of peaceful worship now resonated with sounds of suffering that seemed to mock the very concept of divine mercy and protection. The peaceful atmosphere that had characterized the religious community for hundreds of years had been shattered by the arrival of victims whose affliction transcended ordinary categories of illness or injury. 7 have collapsed since dawn, reported Brother Thomas. The monastery's infirmarian, whose medical knowledge had been acquired through decades of caring for sick and injured members of the religious community, his usually calm voice edged with strain that reflected his struggle to maintain professional composure in the face of unprecedented challenges. His training in the healing arts, while extensive by medieval standards, had not prepared him for patients whose conditions seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of medical science. 2 have not awakened from their collapse, and I fear, he paused, unwilling to voice what both men already knew, the terrible truth that had become increasingly obvious as the crisis deepened. Death had begun to walk among the dancers with the methodical efficiency of a harvest, claiming those whose bodies could no longer sustain the demands of the relentless rhythm that drove their movements with mechanical precision. The spectre of death had transformed the monastery's infirmary from a place of healing into something approaching a charnel house, where the boundaries between life and death seemed as uncertain as the boundaries between sanity and madness that the dancing plague had already obliterated. The presence of the dying dancers created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that affected even the monks, men whose religious training had prepared them to face mortality with equanimity and faith. The bodies of the fallen were carried to the monastery's infirmary, with the same care that would be given to holy relics, where they lay in neat rows on simple wooden cots that had been constructed by the monastery's craftsmen for the care of sick and injured members of their community. The sight of these makeshift beds, arranged with military precision in the stone-walled chamber, created a visual testimony to the scale of the catastrophe that had overwhelmed their city. Their faces, in death, bore expressions of terrible exhaustion that spoke of struggles that had exceeded all human endurance, as if they had been running from something that could never be outpaced, no matter how great their effort or how long they maintained their flight. The expressions frozen on their features suggested that death had come not as release, but as the final exhaustion of resources that had been completely depleted by whatever force had driven their fatal dance. Their feet, those instruments of their suffering that had carried them through days of relentless motion, were wrapped in linen bandages that quickly became stained with blood and other fluids that the medieval mind preferred not to contemplate too closely. The bandages, blessed by the monks before application, seemed to provide no relief from the wounds that continued to weep despite the cessation of movement that death had brought. Master Tannheimer moved among the afflicted, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had dealt with plague and pestilence throughout his long career, his movements reflecting decades of experience with the most challenging medical cases that medieval life could present. He had witnessed the ravages of bubonic plague, the wasting effects of consumption, the violent symptoms of ergot poisoning, and countless other maladies that periodically swept through European communities. But even his considerable experience, gained through years of study at the University of Paris, and decades of practical application in treating the sick and injured of Strasbourg, seemed inadequate to address what he witnessed in the monastery's improvised hospital. The dancing plague operated according to principles that lay outside the boundaries of established medical knowledge, challenging every assumption upon which his profession was based. The dancers who had been brought to the infirmary continued their motion even as they lay dying, their legs moving in weak, spasmodic gestures that mimicked the dance they could not abandon, even in their final moments. This persistence of movement, despite the obvious approach of death, was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire crisis, suggesting that whatever force had claimed these victims operated independently of their physical condition or conscious will. "It is as if their very souls have been captured by some power beyond our understanding," he murmured to Brother Thomas, as they watched a young woman, barely 20 years of age, move her feet in tiny, desperate circles, even as her life ebbed away with each labored breath. Her movements were weak but persistent, following the same rhythm that had driven her through days of relentless dancing, as if the compulsion that had destroyed her body remained active even as death approached. "Some force beyond our understanding has taken hold of them, and they cannot, or will not, release themselves from its grasp, even when that release would mean the preservation of their mortal lives. It is as if they have become instruments of some cosmic purpose that values their participation in this dance more highly than their continued existence as individual human beings." The theological implications of Master Tannheimer's observation were staggering for men whose entire understanding of reality was based upon Christian teaching about the relationship between body and soul, between earthly existence and eternal salvation. If the dancers' souls had indeed been captured by some supernatural force, then the normal relationship between spiritual and physical health had been fundamentally disrupted in ways that challenged basic assumptions about divine justice and human agency. The city's authorities, witnessing the complete failure of their musical intervention and the mounting death toll that made clear the lethal nature of the crisis they faced, had grown desperate in ways that affected their judgment and their willingness to consider solutions that would previously have seemed unthinkable. Master Heinrich Ingold, the Ammeister whose authority encompassed all aspects of civic governance, had called for an emergency consultation with every learned man in the city and the surrounding region. They gathered in the great hall of the Rathaus, the same chamber where decisions about trade, taxation, and civic defense had been made for generations, creating a solemn assembly of physicians, theologians, scholars, and civic leaders who found themselves united, not by shared expertise, but by their common bewilderment and growing fear. The oak table around which they sat had witnessed countless debates about practical problems that had clear solutions, but now it served as the focal point for discussions about phenomena that seemed to exist outside the realm of human understanding. The men who gathered represented the accumulated wisdom and authority of their community, yet they found themselves as helpless as ordinary citizens in the face of events that transcended their collective knowledge and experience. Their usual confidence in the power of human reason and institutional authority to address any crisis had been shattered by their encounter with forces that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to earthly science or divine revelation. "We have tried music, and it made the condition infinitely worse rather than better," reported Master Friedrich Brandt, the chief constable whose responsibilities included maintaining public order and investigating unusual occurrences that might threaten community security. His weathered face, marked by years of dealing with the practical challenges of urban law enforcement, now bore expressions of confusion and frustration that reflected his recognition that traditional approaches to crisis management were proving utterly inadequate. "We have tried physical restraint, and the dancers break free with strength that seems to come from somewhere beyond the natural world, demonstrating power that far exceeds what their physical condition should allow. We have tried bloodletting, purging, the application of cooling herbs, and still the dance continues with undiminished intensity. And now," he paused, his voice heavy with the weight of unwelcome news that he nevertheless felt obligated to share with his colleagues. "Now they begin to die in numbers that suggest we are facing not merely individual cases of madness, but an epidemic that threatens the very survival of our community. The death toll mounts daily, and we have discovered no treatment that provides even temporary relief, much less permanent cure for this affliction that seems to exist outside the normal categories of human illness." The assembled men exchanged troubled glances that spoke of their shared recognition that they were confronting something far beyond their previous experience with urban crises. These were practical individuals, successful merchants, and skilled craftsmen who had achieved positions of civic responsibility through their demonstrated ability to find solutions to the problems that faced their community through the application of reason, experience, and collaborative effort. They had successfully dealt with fires that threatened to consume entire neighborhoods, floods that damaged vital infrastructure, trade disputes that could have disrupted the commercial relationships upon which the city's prosperity depended, and civil unrest that required careful balance between maintaining order and respecting legitimate grievances. Their previous successes had created confidence in their ability to handle any challenge through the application of human wisdom and institutional authority. But this dancing plague seemed to exist outside the normal categories of human experience, defying every attempt at rational explanation or effective treatment, while challenging the fundamental assumptions upon which their understanding of reality was based. The very persistence of the crisis, despite their best efforts to address it through conventional means, suggested that they were dealing with forces that operated according to principles unknown to human learning. Father Benedict Zimmermann, the elderly prior of the Dominican monastery, whose decades of theological study had made him one of the most respected religious authorities in the region, rose slowly from his seat with the careful movements of advanced age. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of decades spent in contemplation of the divine mysteries that governed human existence. But even he seemed shaken by what the city faced and uncertain about the appropriate response to phenomena that challenged established religious understanding. "Perhaps," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision that marked scholarly discourse about complex theological questions, "we have been approaching this matter from the wrong direction entirely. If medical science cannot explain what we witness, if physical restraint proves ineffective against whatever force drives these unfortunate souls, then perhaps we must consider that this affliction has its origins, not in the physical realm but in the spiritual domain." The suggestion hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that the assembled men found difficult to contemplate yet impossible to ignore. If the dancing plague was indeed a spiritual matter rather than a medical condition, then the solutions lay not in the realm of medicine or civil authority, but in the mysterious workings of divine will and supernatural intervention that operated according to laws that human reason could only partially comprehend. The theological framework that Father Zimmermann was suggesting would require them to abandon their reliance upon human expertise and institutional authority in favor of spiritual approaches that might involve prayer, penance, exorcism, or other forms of religious intervention. Such a shift would represent a fundamental acknowledgement that the crisis exceeded the capacity of human knowledge and required divine assistance for its resolution. "You speak of demonic possession," said Master Tannheimer, his voice carefully neutral despite the profound implications of the theological interpretation that Father Zimmermann was proposing. His medical training had taught him to approach such suggestions with scientific skepticism, yet his direct observation of the dancing plague had challenged his confidence in purely naturalistic explanations for what he was witnessing. "But I have witnessed cases of possession during my career, and this phenomenon is fundamentally different from those instances. The possessed speak in tongues that no human language can encompass. They blaspheme against sacred authority with knowledge that seems to come from infernal sources. They display supernatural strength that allows them to break iron bonds and stone walls. These dancers show none of these characteristics." Master Tannheimer's medical experience provided him with a framework for distinguishing between different types of supernatural affliction. Yet the dancing plague seemed to fit none of the established categories that tradition and scholarship had developed for understanding such phenomena. The dancers did not exhibit the classical signs of demonic possession that were described in theological texts and documented in the records of ecclesiastical authorities who had dealt with such cases over the centuries. Instead, they seemed trapped within their own bodies, prisoners of some compulsion they cannot name, understand, or resist through any application of will or conscious effort. They remain recognizably themselves in most respects, yet they have lost control over their physical movements in ways that suggest the intervention of forces that operate according to principles unknown to both medical science and theological tradition. Father Zimmermann nodded slowly, his expression reflecting the deep thought that such complex theological questions required from men who took their intellectual responsibilities seriously. Not possession in the traditional sense, perhaps, but something else entirely. A curse of some kind, a divine punishment for sins that we have not yet identified. Or perhaps, he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, before voicing thoughts that carried profound implications for their understanding of divine justice. Perhaps a test of some kind. A trial sent by divine providence to reveal some hidden truth about our community, our faith, our worthiness in the eyes of the Almighty, who sees all things and judges according to standards that transcend human understanding. Such tests are recorded throughout sacred scripture, from the trials of Job to the plagues of Egypt, instances where God has used suffering to accomplish purposes that remained mysterious to those who experienced them. The theological implications of this suggestion were staggering for a community that had built its identity around its prosperity, its piety, and its assumption that divine favor was reflected in earthly success. If the dancing plague was indeed a divine test, then the appropriate response was not medical treatment or civil intervention, but spiritual purification that would require the entire community to examine its collective soul and identify the sins that had brought this affliction upon them. Such a process would involve public confession, penance, and possibly the identification of scapegoats whose removal from the community might satisfy divine justice and bring an end to the supernatural punishment that was manifesting itself through the dancing plague. The social and political implications of such an approach were almost as disturbing as the continued spread of the affliction itself. As the council debated these profound questions without reaching any clear consensus about appropriate responses, the situation in the streets continued to deteriorate with a speed that suggested whatever force was responsible for the crisis was growing stronger and more aggressive in its assault upon the community. The dancers, driven by their relentless compulsion, had begun to spread beyond the original square where the plague had first manifested itself. Small groups of afflicted individuals could be seen throughout the city, their movements creating pockets of chaos in the normally ordered streets that had been laid out according to rational principles of urban planning. The sound of their dancing had become a constant background noise that penetrated walls and shutters, a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the ancient buildings, and create vibrations that could be felt by anyone who remained still long enough to notice them. The economic life of the city, that complex web of commercial relationships that had made Strasbourg one of the most prosperous communities in the Holy Roman Empire, had ground to a complete halt as the crisis consumed more and more of the population. Merchants abandoned their stalls rather than risk exposure to whatever force was claiming their customers and neighbors. Craftsmen left their workshops as guild members joined the ranks of the afflicted, and even the most essential services began to break down as fear and desperation replaced the normal motivations that sustained urban civilization. The market squares, once bustling with commerce and conversation that reflected the city's role as a center of regional trade, now stood empty, except for the occasional group of dancers who moved through them like ghosts haunting territory that had once been familiar, but was now transformed into something alien and hostile to normal human activity. The abandonment of these commercial centers created visual testimony to the scale of the catastrophe that was overwhelming their community. Master Wilhelm Korn, the guild representative for the bakers whose responsibilities included ensuring adequate food supplies for the urban population, had arrived at the council meeting with particularly disturbing news that illustrated how the crisis was affecting the most basic necessities of urban life. 3 of my guild members have joined the dance since yesterday, he reported, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion that reflected both personal loss and professional concern. Good men, family men, who have never shown any sign of whatever this force is that claims our neighbors and transforms them into something unrecognizable. They simply began dancing in the middle of their work, abandoning their ovens, their families, their responsibilities without warning or explanation. The bread is burning in shops throughout the city because there is no one left to tend the fires, no one willing to risk exposure to whatever contagion spreads this affliction. The implications of this breakdown in essential services were serious for a community that existed in delicate balance with its environment and depended upon the steady production of food for its survival. Strasbourg, like all medieval cities, required the constant labor of skilled craftsmen to maintain the complex systems that supported urban life. The population depended on the steady production of bread, the maintenance of essential services, the continuation of trade and commerce that brought vital supplies from the surrounding countryside. If the dancing plague continued to spread at its current rate, if more essential workers joined the ranks of the afflicted, If fear prevented others from maintaining their posts, the city itself might collapse from within, long before the supernatural crisis that had triggered the breakdown could be resolved. The prospect of social and economic collapse added urgency to the need for effective responses, while simultaneously making such responses more difficult to implement. In their growing desperation, the authorities decided to implement a series of increasingly dramatic measures that reflected their willingness to consider solutions that would previously have seemed excessive or inappropriate. These interventions represented the community's determination to regain control over events that seemed to have developed their own momentum, independent of human will or institutional authority. All music was banned from the city, not just in the affected areas where the dancing was most concentrated, but throughout Strasbourg and even in the surrounding countryside where the city's authority extended. Musicians were ordered to cease their performances immediately. Instruments were confiscated by civic officials and stored in secure locations, and even the singing of work songs that had traditionally accompanied manual labor was forbidden by official decree. The ban on music reflected the authorities' conclusion that rhythmic stimuli of any kind might encourage the dance or draw new victims into its embrace, despite the obvious fact that the dancing continued with undiminished intensity in the absence of any external musical accompaniment. The measure represented a desperate attempt to eliminate any possible factor that might be contributing to the spread of the affliction, regardless of whether such factors have been proven to have any actual connection to the crisis. Public gatherings were severely restricted through emergency legislation that gave civic officials unprecedented authority to regulate social interaction and community activities. Market days were cancelled indefinitely. Religious processions were postponed, despite protests from ecclesiastical authorities, and even private celebrations such as weddings and baptisms were discouraged through official pressure and social conditioning. The authorities hoped that by reducing the opportunities for people to gather in groups, they could limit the spread of the dancing compulsion and prevent new victims from being exposed to whatever force was claiming their neighbors. The social isolation that these measures created was itself a form of suffering, but the officials believed that temporary restrictions on community life were preferable to the continued spread of an affliction that threatened to consume the entire population. Most drastically, all public dancing was prohibited through legislation that carried severe penalties for violation. The dance halls, those centers of social life where young people had traditionally gathered for courtship and celebration, were closed by official decree and sealed with locks that bore the city's official seal. The authorities posted guards at these locations, with orders to arrest anyone who attempted to engage in any form of rhythmic movement that might be interpreted as dancing. The prohibition of dancing represented a fundamental assault on traditional forms of social expression and community celebration, transforming activities that had been central to urban culture for centuries into criminal offenses, punishable by imprisonment or exile. The measure reflected the authorities' desperation and their willingness to sacrifice normal social life in hopes of containing a crisis that threatened far more serious consequences. But these measures, well-intentioned as they were, and implemented with the full authority of civic government, proved largely ineffective against a phenomenon that seemed to operate according to its own mysterious logic. The dancing plague continued to spread despite the absence of music, despite restrictions on public gatherings, despite the prohibition of all forms of rhythmic movement that the authorities could identify and control. The afflicted continued their relentless motion, even when isolated from crowds, even when physically restrained, even when removed from any possible source of external stimulation that might be encouraging their compulsive behavior. The failure of these preventive measures to have any measurable impact on the crisis created additional despair among officials who had exhausted their repertoire of conventional responses to urban emergencies. The death toll continued to mount with mathematical precision that suggested the operation of natural laws, despite the supernatural nature of the phenomenon responsible for the fatalities. By the end of the first week, 15 people had died from exhaustion, heart failure, or the complications of their untreated injuries, their bodies representing the visible cost of a crisis that seemed to escalate regardless of human efforts to contain or control it. Their bodies were laid out in the monastery's chapel, where Brother Thomas and his assistants performed the final rites with increasing frequency and growing sense of helplessness in the face of mortality that seemed to strike without regard for age, social status, or spiritual preparation. The chapel itself, consecrated centuries earlier for the worship of God and the celebration of divine mercy, had become a repository for victims of forces that challenged fundamental assumptions about divine justice and protection. The families of the afflicted gathered in the monastery's courtyard, their faces bearing expressions of grief and bewilderment that reflected their struggle to understand how their loved ones had been transformed so suddenly from familiar human beings into something unrecognizable and ultimately doomed. They had watched their relatives, wives, husbands, children, parents, claimed by a compulsion that seemed to come from beyond the natural world and operated according to principles that defied both medical understanding and religious explanation. Frau Margarete Kohler knelt beside the bed where her daughter Clara lay dying, her vigil representing the countless hours of helpless watching that characterized the experience of families whose members had been claimed by the dancing plague. The girl's feet continued to move in weak, spasmodic motions even as her breathing grew shallow and labored, demonstrating the persistence of whatever force had claimed her body even as death approached with obvious inevitability. Her mother held her hand with the desperate tenderness of someone trying to maintain human connection with a loved one who had been transported to realms beyond reach, whispering prayers and words of comfort that seemed to have no effect upon Clara's condition yet provided some small relief for the speaker. But Clara's eyes remained unfocused, fixed on some distant point that only she could see, suggesting that her consciousness had been claimed as completely as her body by whatever force was responsible for her transformation. "Please," Frau Kohler whispered, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair that had accumulated through days of watching her daughter's condition deteriorate without any hope of improvement. "Please, my darling, you must stop. You must rest. Please come back to me. Come back to your family who loves you and needs you." But Clara could not hear her mother's pleas, could not respond to her touch or her tears, could not acknowledge the presence of the woman who had given her life and devoted herself to her welfare. She was locked in her own private world, a prisoner of the rhythm that had claimed her body and spirit and transformed her from a beloved daughter into an instrument of forces that operated beyond human understanding or control. As the sun set on another day of horror, as the cathedral bells chimed vespers in the distance, and attempted to restore some sense of normal temporal rhythm to a community whose sense of time had been shattered by events that seemed to exist outside normal duration, Clara Kohler danced herself into the darkness that awaited all mortals, her final breath escaping in a sigh that seemed to echo with the phantom music that had driven her to this fate. The monastery's bell tower began to toll the death knell, its bronze voice carrying across the city like a lament for all those who had been lost to the dancing plague, all those who would be lost in the days to come, and all those who survived to witness the destruction of everything they had believed about the nature of reality. The sound mingled with the constant percussion of the dancers' feet, creating a symphony of sorrow that seemed to capture the very essence of Strasbourg's suffering. As night fell over the stricken city, as the torches were lit in a vain attempt to restore some semblance of normal activity, as the guards took their positions around the perimeter of the affected areas, the people of Strasbourg began to realize that they were facing something that challenged the very foundations of their world. The familiar rhythms of daily life had been replaced by the alien cadence of the dance, a rhythm that seemed to pulse with its own dark life, independent of human will or divine mercy. The dancing plague had become a force of nature, as unstoppable as the tide or the turning of the seasons, yet far more malevolent in its effects upon human life and community stability. And in the growing darkness of the summer night, as the afflicted continued their relentless motion, and the death toll mounted with inexorable mathematical precision, the survivors began to understand that they were witnessing something that would forever change their understanding of the world and their place in it, something that challenged every assumption they had made about the relationship between divine justice and human suffering, between individual will and cosmic purpose, between the natural and supernatural worlds that intersected in ways too complex for human comprehension. Segment 4. Theories behind the madness. The second week of the dancing plague brought with it a subtle but profound shift in the city's atmosphere that reflected the community's gradual adaptation to circumstances that had initially seemed incomprehensible and temporary. The initial shock and confusion that had paralyzed rational thought and institutional response had given way to a grim acceptance, a recognition that this strange affliction might persist far longer than anyone had originally imagined, and would require sustained intellectual effort to understand if it could not be immediately cured. The constant sound of dancing feet had become woven into the fabric of daily existence, as familiar and inescapable as the chiming of the cathedral bells that marked the canonical hours, or the steady flow of the Rhine beyond the city walls. The rhythm that had once seemed alien and threatening had achieved a kind of normalization through sheer persistence, becoming part of the acoustic landscape that defined life in Strasbourg during this extraordinary period. Citizens who had initially fled from the sound now moved through their daily routines with the percussion of relentless footsteps, providing a constant background to their activities. Merchants conducted business while the dance continued in nearby streets. Craftsmen worked at their trades despite the distraction of the ceaseless rhythm, and families gathered for meals while the supernatural soundtrack of their crisis played outside their windows. In the monastery of St. Thomas, now serving the dual functions of hospital and morgue, in ways that would have been unimaginable during the peaceful centuries of its religious existence, the scholars and physicians had begun to approach the phenomenon with a more systematic methodology that reflected their determination to impose rational understanding upon events that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of human knowledge. The monastery's transformation from a place of contemplative prayer into a center of scientific investigation represented one of the most significant developments of the crisis, as men of learning from across the region gathered to pool their expertise and observations in hopes of developing theoretical frameworks that might explain what they were witnessing. If they could not cure the dancing plague through the application of existing medical knowledge or religious intervention, perhaps they could at least understand it through careful observation, systematic analysis, and collaborative intellectual effort. Knowledge, they reasoned with the optimism that characterized medieval scholarship, might provide some measure of comfort and control, even in the absence of effective treatment or immediate resolution. The pursuit of understanding had taken on existential importance for a community whose entire worldview had been challenged by events that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to human science or divine revelation. The intellectual effort to comprehend the dancing plague represented not merely academic curiosity, but a fundamental struggle to restore meaning and order to a universe that had apparently been invaded by forces of chaos and irrationality. Master Johann Tannheimer, whose medical expertise had been proven inadequate to treat the affliction, but whose scholarly training remained relevant to the task of understanding it, had begun keeping detailed records of each case with the methodical precision that characterized serious scientific investigation. His observations, written in careful Latin script on sheets of precious parchment that represented significant financial investment in the pursuit of knowledge, would become one of the few contemporary accounts of the plague to survive the passage of centuries. His documentation efforts reflected both professional obligation and personal fascination with phenomena that challenged every assumption upon which his medical training was based. Each case was recorded with attention to details that might prove significant: the victim's age, social status, family history, diet, recent experiences, and the specific characteristics of their dancing behavior. The affliction shows no preference for age or station, he wrote by candlelight in his small monastic cell, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock his efforts to impose rational categories upon irrational phenomena. Young and old, rich and poor, devout and worldly, all seem equally susceptible to its influence. Yet there are patterns, subtle connections that suggest underlying causes we have yet to identify or properly understand. His observations challenged prevailing assumptions about the relationship between social status and susceptibility to supernatural influences, contradicting traditional beliefs that wealth, education, and pious behavior provided protection against demonic assault or divine punishment. The democratic nature of the affliction suggested causes that operated independently of moral character or spiritual preparation. Brother Thomas, the monastery's infirmarian, whose medical knowledge had been acquired through decades of practical experience with illness and injury, had noticed similar patterns in his own careful observations of the victims who passed through the improvised medical facility. His perspective, shaped by years of tending to the physical needs of the religious community, provided insights that complemented the more theoretical approach of university-trained physicians. The dancers seemed to come from particular neighborhoods, he reported to the assembled scholars during one of their evening consultations, his voice carrying the authority of direct experience with the afflicted. Certain streets, certain quarters of the city produce more victims than others, suggesting geographic factors that we have not yet identified, and many of the afflicted share common experiences: recent losses, family tragedies, economic hardship that has pushed them beyond their normal capacity for endurance. This geographic clustering of cases provided the first clear evidence that the dancing plague might have identifiable causes that could be studied through systematic investigation rather than supernatural origins that defied human understanding. The pattern suggested environmental factors, social conditions, or other circumstances that could be analyzed and potentially controlled through rational intervention. The observation about shared traumatic experiences opened another avenue for investigation, suggesting psychological factors that might predispose certain individuals to succumb to whatever force was responsible for the dancing compulsion. The correlation between personal suffering and susceptibility to the plague implied that the phenomenon might be understood through existing knowledge about human psychology and the effects of stress upon mental and physical health. This observation led to the development of the first serious theoretical framework for understanding the plague that drew upon established scholarly traditions rather than supernatural explanations. Father Benedict Zimmermann, drawing upon his extensive theological training and his familiarity with classical texts that addressed questions of human psychology and social behavior, proposed that the dancing mania was a manifestation of mass hysteria, a collective response to the accumulated stresses and anxieties of urban life in the early 16th century. The hysteria theory represented a significant departure from supernatural explanations while remaining consistent with medieval understanding of the relationship between mental and physical health. It suggested that the dancing plague could be understood as an extreme but fundamentally natural response to circumstances that had exceeded the normal capacity of human psychology to process and endure. Consider the context in which this phenomenon has emerged. Father Zimmermann argued during one of their evening discussions, his words carrying the weight of decades spent studying the relationship between spiritual and psychological health. The harvest has been poor for 2 consecutive years, creating genuine food shortages that affect even prosperous families. The price of grain has doubled, then tripled, forcing many households to choose between adequate nutrition and other necessities. His analysis placed the dancing plague within the broader context of social and economic stress that had been building throughout the region for months before the first manifestations of the affliction. The correlation between material hardship and psychological breakdown suggested causal relationships that could be understood through existing knowledge about human behavior under extreme stress. Add to this the constant rumors of war that circulate through our markets and taverns, the religious tensions that divide our community along confessional lines, the persistent fear of plague and pestilence that haunts every urban center, and the general sense of uncertainty about the future that characterizes our age. Is it any wonder that some souls pushed beyond their psychological limits might break in such a dramatic and visible fashion? The hysteria theory gained substantial support from the detailed observations compiled by Master Friedrich Brandt, the city's chief constable, whose responsibilities included maintaining detailed records of civil disturbances and investigating unusual occurrences that might threaten public order. His men had compiled comprehensive reports on the backgrounds of the afflicted, and the patterns they revealed provided compelling evidence for psychological explanations of the phenomenon. The demographic data collected by the constabulary revealed striking correlations that supported the stress-related hypothesis. A disproportionate number of the dancers were women, particularly those who had recently suffered significant losses, widows whose husbands had died from disease or accident, mothers who had lost children to the high infant mortality that characterized medieval life, young women whose marriages had been broken by death or abandonment. It is as if, Master Brandt explained to the assembled council with the clarity that came from analyzing concrete evidence rather than abstract theories, the accumulated grief and desperation of our community has found expression in this terrible dance. The afflicted are not truly dancing in any conventional sense. They are fleeing from sorrows too great to bear through normal psychological mechanisms. This psychological explanation resonated strongly with many of the city's leaders because it provided a rational framework for understanding an apparently irrational phenomenon, while suggesting that the plague might eventually resolve itself as the underlying social tensions were addressed through appropriate interventions. The theory implied that human agency and institutional action could play meaningful roles in addressing the crisis. The hysteria theory also explained the contagious nature of the affliction without requiring supernatural mechanisms. The power of suggestion, the human tendency to imitate behavior observed in others, and the psychological pressure created by witnessing extreme distress could account for the spread of the dancing compulsion from individual to individual and neighborhood to neighborhood. But even as the scholarly community debated the merits of psychological explanations for the dancing mania, other investigators were exploring more concrete, physical explanations that located the source of the phenomenon in the material environment, rather than the realm of human psychology. These researchers believed that the answer to the mystery lay not in the complexities of the human mind or spirit, but in identifiable toxins or environmental factors that could be detected and eliminated through scientific investigation. Master Wilhelm Brenner, a traveling physician who had arrived from the prestigious University of Basel with knowledge of recent developments in natural philosophy and medical theory, brought with him familiarity with similar dancing epidemics that had occurred in other parts of Europe during the preceding decades. His comparative approach to understanding the Strasbourg outbreak provided new perspectives that challenged purely local explanations of the phenomenon. I have investigated reports of comparable dancing manias in the Low Countries, in parts of Germany, and even in distant regions of France, he announced during a meeting of the Scholarly Council that had been convened to evaluate various theoretical approaches to understanding the crisis. The similarities between these outbreaks suggest common causative factors that transcend local social conditions or psychological pressures. His comparative analysis revealed patterns that suggested environmental rather than psychological causes for the dancing plagues. The outbreaks tended to occur during periods of wet weather that promoted the growth of certain fungi. They affected agricultural communities that depended heavily upon grain consumption, and they often coincided with reports of unusual discoloration or contamination in local food supplies. I have examined samples of grain from the affected neighborhoods here in Strasbourg, he continued, producing specimens that had been carefully collected from various bakeries and mills throughout the city. The wheat and rye show clear signs of contamination with a fungus that grows in damp conditions and produces compounds known to affect the human nervous system. This ergot, as it is known to scholars who have studied such matters, produces alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and compulsive behavior when consumed in sufficient quantities over extended periods. The ergot poisoning theory offered a compelling explanation for many aspects of the dancing plague that had puzzled previous investigators. The fungus grew primarily in wet conditions, and the summer of 1518 had been particularly damp, with frequent rains that created ideal conditions for fungal contamination of grain crops. The geographic distribution of ergot contamination was uneven, which might explain why certain neighborhoods produced more victims than others, while adjacent areas remained largely unaffected. Most importantly, from a medical perspective, ergot poisoning was known to produce exactly the kinds of symptoms that had been witnessed in Strasbourg: visual and auditory hallucinations that might account for the dancer's apparent response to unheard music, uncontrollable movements that resembled the compulsive behavior of the afflicted, and a burning sensation in the extremities that might drive victims to dance in a desperate attempt to find relief from their discomfort. The bread that sustains our daily life, Master Brenner explained with the clarity that came from understanding complex phenomena through scientific analysis, has become a vehicle for poison that attacks the nervous system and disrupts the normal relationship between conscious will and physical behavior. The afflicted dance not from madness or spiritual compulsion, but because their bodies have been invaded by toxic substances that create irresistible urges to move. This physiological explanation gained substantial credibility when several of the city's bakers confirmed that they had indeed noticed unusual discoloration in some of their grain supplies during the weeks preceding the outbreak of the dancing plague. The fungus, they admitted under questioning, had been more prevalent than usual due to the wet weather, though they had attempted to remove the most obviously contaminated portions before milling the grain into flour. The baker's testimony provided crucial corroborating evidence for the ergot theory, while also explaining why the contamination had not been detected earlier. Medieval grain processing techniques were not designed to identify subtle fungal contamination, and economic pressures encouraged the use of all available grain, despite quality concerns. The practice of mixing contaminated grain with clean supplies could have distributed low levels of ergot alkaloids throughout the city's bread supply. But even the ergot theory, compelling as it appeared and supported as it was by scientific evidence and expert testimony, failed to explain all aspects of the dancing plague that had been carefully documented by the various observers who had studied the phenomenon. If simple poisoning was the sole cause of the affliction, several puzzling questions remained unanswered. Why did the afflicted seem to move in synchronized patterns that suggested coordination or communication between individuals who showed no other signs of conscious awareness? Why did the presence of music intensify their compulsions in ways that seemed to transcend the effects of chemical intoxication? And why did some people who had demonstrably eaten the same contaminated bread remain completely unaffected, while others succumbed immediately to the dancing compulsion? The limitations of single-factor explanations led to the development of more sophisticated theoretical approaches that attempted to account for the full complexity of the phenomenon. As the scholars debated these questions during their daily consultations, a third theory began to emerge that combined elements of both psychological and physical explanations, while acknowledging the role of social and cultural factors in shaping the epidemic's progression. Master Johannes Geiler von Kaisersberg, a renowned preacher and theologian whose reputation for learning extended throughout the German-speaking territories of the Holy Roman Empire, proposed that the dancing plague was the result of a complex interaction between individual psychology, social pressure, and environmental factors. His integrated approach reflected the medieval understanding that human health involved the harmonious balance of multiple influences, rather than simple cause and effect relationships. "Consider the times in which we live," he said, during a sermon delivered to the city's remaining population, his words carrying the authority of a man who had spent decades studying the relationship between spiritual and temporal affairs. The old certainties of faith and social order are being challenged daily by new ideas, new technologies, new forms of religious and political organization. The very foundations of our world seem to shift beneath our feet as traditions that sustained our ancestors prove inadequate to address contemporary challenges. His analysis placed the dancing plague within the broader context of social transformation that characterized the early 16th century, a period when traditional authority structures were being challenged by religious reformation, economic change, and political reorganization. The psychological stress created by rapid social change might have made certain individuals more susceptible to unusual forms of mental breakdown. In such circumstances of fundamental uncertainty, Master Geiler continued, is it not natural that some souls already weakened by physical hunger and emotional loss might seek escape from unbearable reality through the most dramatic means available to them? The dance becomes a form of flight from consciousness, a refuge from pressures that exceed the normal capacity of human psychology to endure. This integrated theory suggested that the dancing plague was neither purely physical nor purely psychological, but rather the result of what contemporary scholars might call a perfect storm of contributing factors that had combined to create conditions favorable for the emergence of an unprecedented form of collective breakdown. Each factor was necessary but insufficient to cause the phenomenon. Only their combination had produced the extraordinary crisis that had overwhelmed the city. The ergot contamination might have provided the initial neurochemical trigger, creating hallucinations and physical discomfort that manifested as compulsive movement in susceptible individuals. The social stress created by economic hardship, religious uncertainty, and political instability might have made certain people more vulnerable to these neurochemical effects, while providing psychological motivation for escape through altered consciousness. The power of social suggestion and imitation might have caused the phenomenon to spread even to individuals who had not been directly affected by the ergot poisoning, as the sight of others dancing created psychological pressure to join the collective expression of distress. The cultural framework that interpreted unusual behavior as evidence of supernatural intervention might have reinforced the dancing compulsion by providing a narrative that made the affliction meaningful rather than merely pathological. As the third week of the plague began with no apparent diminishment in the intensity or scope of the crisis, the city's authorities decided to test these various theories through practical interventions that would either confirm or refute the different explanations that had been proposed. The systematic testing of theoretical frameworks represented an early example of what would later be recognized as scientific methodology applied to public health challenges. If ergot poisoning was indeed the primary cause of the dancing plague, then removing all contaminated grain from the city's food supply should halt the spread of new cases, while allowing existing victims to recover as the toxins were eliminated from their systems. If mass hysteria was the dominant factor, then addressing the underlying social and economic problems that had created psychological stress might provide relief for both current victims and potential future cases. The grain purge began immediately under the supervision of Master Brenner and his assistants, who had been granted extraordinary authority to inspect and confiscate any food supplies that showed signs of contamination. Every bakery, every mill, every private storehouse was systematically examined by teams of officials who had been trained to identify the subtle signs of ergot infection that had previously escaped detection. All grain showing even minimal signs of fungal contamination was removed from circulation and transported outside the city walls, where it was burned in great pyres that created dark columns of smoke visible for miles around the city. The smoke from these fires became a visible symbol of the community's desperate attempt to cleanse itself of the poison that had invaded its most basic food supply, while the economic cost of destroying substantial quantities of grain demonstrated the seriousness with which the authorities approached the crisis. The systematic destruction of potentially contaminated food supplies created immediate practical problems for a community that depended upon bread as its primary source of nutrition. Emergency arrangements had to be made to import grain from distant regions where ergot contamination was unlikely, while alternative food sources were identified and distributed to prevent widespread hunger during the transition period. Simultaneously, the City Council implemented a comprehensive series of social reforms designed to address the economic hardships and psychological stresses that might have contributed to the mass hysteria that some scholars believed was responsible for the dancing plague. Emergency food distributions were organized for the city's poor, funded by contributions from wealthy merchant families who recognized that community survival required collective action. Work programs were established to provide employment for those who had lost their livelihoods during the crisis, while debt forgiveness programs offered relief for families who had been pushed toward destitution by the economic disruptions of the preceding months. The city's churches organized special prayer services designed to provide comfort and spiritual guidance to those struggling with loss and despair, while community gatherings were arranged to restore social bonds that had been weakened by fear and isolation. But perhaps most importantly, the authorities began to address the dancing plague through the mobilization of spiritual resources that represented the community's most powerful tools for confronting supernatural challenges. If the physical and psychological remedies had failed to provide complete relief, then perhaps the answer lay in the realm of faith and divine intervention that operated according to laws beyond human understanding. The organization of a great religious procession represented the culmination of the community's spiritual response to the crisis, involving the entire surviving population of the city in a collective act of prayer and penance, designed to restore divine favor and protection. The most sacred relics were brought forth from the cathedral treasury, fragments of the true cross that had been acquired through generous donations from wealthy pilgrims, bones of saints whose intercession had protected the city during previous crises, vessels that had been blessed by popes and emperors during their visits to Strasbourg. The preparation for this procession required extensive planning and coordination, as routes were mapped through every street of the city to ensure that the sacred presence would reach every neighborhood where the dancing plague had manifested itself. The participants were organized according to traditional hierarchies that reflected social status, while emphasizing the unity of the Christian community in the face of supernatural challenges. The procession itself wound through the narrow streets with solemn dignity, the participants chanting prayers and hymns that had been specifically selected for their power to drive away evil influences and restore divine protection to communities under supernatural assault. The Latin words echoed off the stone walls of the ancient buildings, creating acoustic effects that seemed to transform the entire city into a vast cathedral dedicated to the pursuit of divine mercy. The afflicted dancers were carried on specially constructed litters as part of this procession, their families hoping that proximity to the sacred relics might break whatever spell held them captive. The sight of the victims being borne through the streets, like holy martyrs, created powerful emotional responses among the participants, reinforcing the sense that they were engaged in spiritual warfare against forces that threatened not only individual souls, but the entire community. Some witnesses reported that certain dancers seemed to calm during the procession, their movements becoming less frenzied and their expressions less strained, suggesting that the spiritual intervention was indeed having beneficial effects. These improvements, however slight, provided encouragement for those who believed that religious solutions offered the best hope for resolving the crisis. But the most dramatic and decisive intervention came when the procession reached the shrine of Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and those afflicted with movement disorders. whose spiritual authority over such conditions had been recognized throughout Christian Europe for centuries. According to ancient tradition, Saint Vitus possessed the power to both cause and cure dancing mania, and his shrine in Strasbourg's cathedral had been a destination for pilgrims seeking relief from similar afflictions for generations. The shrine itself was a masterwork of medieval craftsmanship, its golden reliquary decorated with precious stones and intricate carvings that proclaimed the saint's power, while providing a focal point for prayer and meditation. The area around the shrine had been specially prepared for the climactic moment of the procession, with additional candles and incense creating an atmosphere of heightened spiritual intensity. As the procession approached the shrine with solemn ceremony, carrying the afflicted dancers toward their hoped-for salvation, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered as either divine miracle or natural coincidence, depending upon one's theological perspective and scientific understanding. The lead dancers, those who had been afflicted the longest, and whose conditions had seemed most hopeless, suddenly collapsed to the ground in perfect unison. For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire procession held its breath, fearing that they had witnessed mass death rather than the hoped-for healing. The sight of dozens of bodies falling simultaneously created panic among the participants, who wondered whether their spiritual intervention had somehow worsened the crisis rather than resolving it. But then, slowly and miraculously, the fallen dancers began to stir, not in the frenzied, compulsive movements that had characterized their affliction for weeks, but in normal, controlled gestures that suggested the return of conscious will and rational behavior. Their movements were weak and unsteady, like those of people recovering from a long and serious illness, but they were recognizably human rather than the mechanical automatons they had become. One by one, the dancers began to rise to their feet with the assistance of family members and fellow citizens, their faces showing awareness and recognition for the first time since the onset of their affliction. The terrible compulsion that had driven them through weeks of relentless motion seemed to have been broken completely, as if a spell had been lifted, or a fever had finally broken after running its natural course. The crowd that witnessed this unprecedented moment erupted in cries of joy and thanksgiving that echoed through the cathedral and spilled out into the surrounding streets, where citizens who had not participated directly in the procession heard the celebration and understood that something momentous had occurred. Families rushed forward to embrace their recovered loved ones, and the entire procession dissolved into a spontaneous celebration of divine mercy and miraculous healing. The emotional intensity of this moment created a cathartic release for a community that had endured weeks of fear, confusion, and helplessness in the face of forces that had seemed beyond human control or understanding. The apparent success of the spiritual intervention validated traditional beliefs about the power of faith, while providing hope that the crisis had finally been resolved through divine intervention. But even as the city celebrated its apparent deliverance from the supernatural forces that had terrorized it for weeks, the scholars and physicians continued to debate the true causes of both the plague and its dramatic resolution. Had the spiritual intervention actually cured the dancers through divine miracle, or had the various physical and psychological remedies finally taken effect after a natural delay period? Was the recovery the result of supernatural healing, or simply the natural conclusion of a phenomenon that had run its predetermined course, according to laws that human understanding had not yet identified? The timing of the resolution coincided with so many different interventions that determining the actual cause of the cure proved as challenging as identifying the original source of the affliction. Master Tannheimer, ever the careful observer and systematic investigator, noted in his detailed records that the recovery coincided with several other significant factors that might have contributed to the resolution of the crisis. The contaminated grain had been completely removed from the city's food supply for nearly a week, allowing sufficient time for any ergot alkaloids to be eliminated from the victim's systems through natural metabolic processes. The emergency social programs had begun to alleviate some of the economic pressures and psychological stresses that might have contributed to mass hysteria, providing practical support for families while restoring hope for future stability. The weather had turned cooler and drier, potentially reducing the environmental factors that promoted ergot growth while creating atmospheric conditions that might have had beneficial effects on both physical and mental health. Perhaps, he wrote in his final report on the plague, a document that would serve as the primary source for future scholars seeking to understand this extraordinary episode, The truth encompasses all of these explanations rather than requiring us to choose among them. The dancing mania may have been caused by a complex combination of physical poisoning, psychological stress, and social contagion, each factor contributing to the overall phenomenon in ways that amplified the effects of the others. His conclusion reflected the intellectual humility that the crisis had imposed upon all who had attempted to understand it, a recognition that complex phenomena might require multiple explanations rather than simple single-factor theories. The dancing plague had demonstrated the limitations of medieval knowledge, while pointing toward more sophisticated approaches to understanding the relationship between physical, psychological, and social factors in human health. Its resolution may have required not just one intervention, but many: the removal of environmental toxins, the provision of social support, the restoration of communal hope through shared religious experience, and perhaps most importantly, the natural passage of time that allowed various healing processes to take effect. The human body and spirit possess remarkable powers of recovery when provided with appropriate conditions and adequate time for restoration. As the summer of 1518 drew to a close, and the first hints of autumn began to appear in the cooler nights and shorter days, Strasbourg slowly began to return to something approximating normal life. The market squares filled once again with merchants and customers who conducted their business with renewed appreciation for the simple pleasures of ordinary commerce, while the workshops resumed their familiar rhythms of production as craftsmen returned to trades that had been interrupted by the supernatural crisis. The streets echoed with the ordinary sounds of daily life, rather than the terrible percussion of compulsive dancing, the calls of vendors selling their wares, the laughter of children playing games that had been forbidden during the height of the crisis, the conversations of neighbors who could once again gather without fear of supernatural contagion. The restoration of normal acoustic environment provided psychological relief that was almost as important as the resolution of the dancing plague itself. The scars of the plague remained visible throughout the community, however, serving as permanent reminders of the summer when reality had seemed to collapse and the familiar world had been transformed into something alien and threatening. More than 40 people had died during the 3 weeks of the dancing mania, their deaths representing not only individual tragedies, but also the broader cost of a crisis that had challenged every assumption the community held about the nature of existence. Many more survivors bore psychological wounds that would never fully heal, family members who had watched loved ones transformed into something unrecognizable, witnesses who had seen the foundations of reality shake beneath their feet, officials who had discovered the limitations of human authority when confronted with supernatural forces. The collective trauma of the experience would influence the community's character for generations to come. The city's confidence in its ability to understand and control the world through the application of reason, institutional authority, and traditional wisdom had been profoundly shaken by the encounter with forces that seemed to operate according to laws unknown to human learning. This loss of intellectual certainty was replaced by a more humble recognition of the mysterious forces that could emerge from the complex intersection of human psychology, social pressure, and environmental circumstance. The dancing plague of 1518 would be remembered as one of the most extraordinary events in Strasbourg's long and eventful history, a reminder that even in the most ordered and rational of human communities, there lurked the potential for chaos and mystery that could challenge every assumption upon which civilized life was based. The event would serve as a permanent caution against intellectual pride and institutional overconfidence. The scholars who had witnessed the crisis and participated in the efforts to understand it would carry the memory with them for the rest of their lives, a testament to both the fragility of human reason when confronted with the inexplicable and the enduring power of collaborative investigation in the pursuit of understanding. Their experience would influence their approach to other mysterious phenomena, while teaching them respect for the limits of human knowledge. As we conclude this strange and haunting tale that has carried us through the narrow streets of a medieval city, transformed by forces beyond comprehension, imagine yourself walking through those same streets in the cool evening air of late summer, when the crisis has passed, and normal life has resumed its ancient patterns. The cobblestones beneath your feet are silent now, bearing no trace of the terrible rhythm that once echoed through these passages with supernatural persistence. The houses rise peacefully around you, their windows glowing with the warm, steady light of candles and oil lamps, their inhabitants safe in their beds and protected by the familiar rhythms of ordinary life that the crisis had temporarily shattered, but could not permanently destroy. The restoration of domestic tranquility represents perhaps the greatest miracle of all, the simple fact that human communities can endure the most extraordinary challenges and emerge with their essential character intact. The dancing plague had ended as mysteriously as it had begun, leaving behind only questions and theories, memories and scars, cautionary tales and hard-won wisdom about the complexity of human existence. But in its wake, it had revealed something fundamental about the human condition that transcended the specific circumstances of 16th century Strasbourg, our shared vulnerability to forces beyond our control, our remarkable capacity for both individual suffering and collective healing, and our endless search for meaning in the face of the inexplicable. Sleep now, and let the quiet rhythms of the night wash away the echoes of that terrible dance that once consumed a community, but could not destroy its essential humanity. In the morning, you will wake to a world where such mysteries seem impossible, where the ordinary miracle of controlled movement seems as natural as breathing, where the dance of daily life proceeds according to rhythms we can understand and music we can hear. But remember, as you drift into peaceful slumber, that the line between order and chaos, between the normal and the extraordinary, between the rational and the inexplicable, is far thinner than we might wish to believe. The town that danced itself to the edge of madness had learned to live again, but it would never forget the summer, when the very foundations of reality seemed to shift beneath its feet, when the familiar became strange, and when the mystery of human existence revealed itself in its most dramatic and disturbing form. And so ends our journey through one of history's most enigmatic episodes, the dancing plague of Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, a tale that has carried us from the narrow streets of a medieval city to the deepest questions about human nature and the forces that shape our collective destiny. As you rest now in the comfort of your modern world, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of contemporary life and protected by scientific understanding that would have seemed miraculous to those distant witnesses, let your mind gently release the images and echoes of that extraordinary time. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be filled with the quiet music of a world at peace, where dance is a celebration of joy rather than a compulsion of despair, where community provides healing rather than contagion, and where the rhythms of life proceed according to the ancient patterns that have sustained humanity through countless generations of challenge and triumph. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing replace the echoes of those ancient feet on cobblestones. Let the warmth of your bed embrace you as the community of Strasbourg ultimately embraced its survivors, and let the peaceful silence of the night restore your faith in the fundamental stability of existence. And as you drift into peaceful sleep, know that the greatest mysteries often resolve themselves not through complete understanding, but through the simple passage of time and the enduring power of human hope to overcome even the darkest challenges. In the end, perhaps the true lesson of the dancing plague is not about the specific causes or cures of that strange affliction, though the theories proposed by medieval scholars continue to offer insights into the complex relationship between physical, psychological, and social factors in human health. Rather, the enduring significance of the episode lies in what it reveals about the resilience of human communities in the face of the unknown and the power of collaborative effort to address even the most unprecedented challenges. The people of Strasbourg, like us, sought to understand their world through the tools available to them: medicine and faith, reason and tradition, community action and individual courage, systematic observation and collaborative investigation. They faced the inexplicable with the same mixture of fear and determination, curiosity and caution, that humans have always brought to the mysteries that surround us and challenge our assumptions about the nature of reality. The city that danced itself to the edge of madness found its way back to sanity through a combination of scientific investigation, social support, spiritual intervention, and the simple passage of time that allows healing processes to take effect. Its people discovered new sources of strength and compassion in their shared struggle against forces that seem to transcend human understanding, and life continued in all its ordinary magnificence, despite the temporary intrusion of chaos into their ordered world.